Started, and we'll start with council meeting follow-up. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members of the council. I don't think I have anything to cover on this part of the agenda, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Anybody? Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thanks, Mayor. So really quickly, I just want to do a real quick update on a follow-up on our nicotine resolution or ordinance that we're trying to get in line with state statute. Amber and I met with a couple members from Mercer Family Resource Center, John and our chief, to have a conversation about what an amendment would look like to how we could establish and line up the educational component that we would need for students that are younger. So I'm going to offer up an amendment. We're working on that. I know John's going to be working on a few things to see how we can tie that in with what flexibility we have with the state statute. For me, it's going to be, and maybe Amber might want to say a couple things too, but for me, it's the opportunity, anybody that's 18 or younger, 17 and younger, would be required to take some type of tobacco or nicotine educational classes as a part of being that fine as well. So we're going to try to put that together somehow, but I think the 18 and older, I think we're going to steer away from that, but we'll craft that a little bit more. But I want to give everybody kind of a heads up that that's kind of the direction I'm planning on going, and I think it's really important that we look at that. And so I don't know, Amber, if you have anything to say.
Well, okay. The only thing I'd add is really the reason we're trying to look at coming up with a way to require that class is that the fee being lowered so dramatically no longer provides any sort of incentive for people to take the class in lieu of the fee. So by doing that, we've kind of created a situation where we've seen a reduction in the number of people actually attending, number of high school students or junior high students attending these classes, which we think would be, ultimately down the road will result in negative health impacts for the community. So that's really the only reason that we're looking at that, is just because now by changing the fee structure, we have also changed the incentivization to take that class.
Can I say one more thing? Mm-hmm. Yeah, just really quickly too, and Amber just reminded me, and I think that's really the crux of it, is it's not to add more criminal persecution to these kids. It's more about how we can offer tobacco and nicotine education for these kids, because it shows that it proves that it works, and we need to be able to do that. And $25 is not working. They're paying their $25 and they're just going on and they're continuing to use nicotine, et cetera. So that's my hope. I'm going to steer clear from 18 on up, but I think the 17 and younger is something that can be done. So you'll probably hear from me or whatnot as we kind of do that. If you have any questions or want any more explanations about that, let me know. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else with council follow-up from last meeting? Okay, and I'll also make note that Councilwoman Lutz is on the phone with us. She just couldn't be here tonight, so. Okay, we'll move on to parking on parkways and parking manual. Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. There have been a couple of you that have suggested that we should have this conversation as it relates to the use of the parkways throughout the community. For those of you who may not be aware, the parkway is the area that generally is in between the street and the sidewalk that is in front of folks' homes. A lot of times the neighbors are not totally knowledgeable as to what that property is for them. Folks use it for parking. They use it for landscaping. Some will even, pave it over and those kinds of things. There is some confusion as to how that land can be used. And what the reality is generally speaking, those parkways are a part of the right-of-way. And the ordinance does suggest that while it is city-owned property, again, a part of the right-of-way, it generally is on the responsibility of the adjacent property owner to maintain it. So if there's grass there, we would anticipate that the property owner would mow that area and so on. Some of the conversation that has also been for us, particularly internally, along the lines of just parking in general. We have some ambiguity as it relates to some of the permits. We have some fee structure that doesn't make sense. And so we took this opportunity to address these issues on a more holistic level so that from a comprehensive basis, we could have some direction from council with regard to a number of issues, not the least of which would be with regard to how to use the parkways and what the ordinance should say as it relates to those pieces of property. So indeed, we're hoping that ultimately we can get some direction as it relates to how those parkway areas should be viewed by staff. We're also hopeful that we can get some direction as it relates to some of the permit issues that we are suggesting, particularly as it relates to the fee structure with respect to those specific permits. And so I'd ask you to think about those things as we visit with you. We've had a team of staff kind of working on these things, talking about recommendations that we'd bring forward. And the purpose of our visit tonight is to introduce you to those concepts, let you know where we're coming from, and see what it is that council would like to do in terms of moving forward, whether that's doing more homework or giving us some definitive direction as to what we should prepare for formal consideration. And so with that, if I could, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to defer to Director Becker, who helped us prepare for this conversation, and I've also asked the chief to be prepared for some comments as well.
Okay. Ms. Becker?
Your Honor, members of council. As our city manager stated, there's quite a few issues and topics we'd like to visit with you tonight about. And again, by way of background, the city has embarked upon a new software system. And with that, it's called InterGov. And this system is one that's going to touch a lot of our permitting and our licensing for the city. It's going to help streamline permitting and licensing, not only from initiation, but through to our finance system. And so in working on this, several of us over the past year have started looking at permits and licenses and how those are issued within the city to our citizenry. In the past, starting kind of at a high level, we had a one-sheet form that a citizen would get to say, hey, I need a handicap spot, I need a spot to park because I've got construction going on outside of my storefront, I live around a school district, so I'm in a critical parking zone around NC, or I want to park my RV on the street for the summer so it's easy to access when I want to pull it out. I want to pull it out of storage and just park it on a city street so I can have that. So we started looking at a lot of this. And this team of city staff, and again, it's written in the memo, and I'm going to be referring to the memo a little bit tonight with this presentation, got together, and it was the police department, public services, our city clerk, community development in the form of code enforcement, and our finance department. So all of us started looking at how we touch the issue of permitting and licensing. And truly, many of us touched it in different ways and wasn't always the most efficient for our citizens. So how many people need to touch an RV permit? They got to get signatures from neighbors. It was a very kind of a roundabout process, and then we're tracking it and making sure we get it into the system financially. Is it the fair price? And then how do we do it all over again next year? So the exercise tonight I wanted to visit with you about is kind of how that started. So we got together, we looked at our parking manual for the city. And what we had put together in our memo of last week is that the parking manual had last been really updated in 2010. So it's time to relook at that. So we stopped and took the time to really look at what was contained in the 2010 parking manual to bring it current to 2021, not only with programs and efficiencies, but also from truly a reporting standpoint and whose department was really overseeing and doing the work. What I'd like to start with this evening is to hit some of the high points that when we got into the parking manual, and as you'll see, it does talk about what our city manager referenced, which is looking not only at the permitting, but also at the fee structure and parking on the parkway. So it encompasses all of it. It was a very large document. In the packet, we put together the red line version, as well as now the revised version that staff has brought forward to you, and then we've had some other documents in there. But with the actual parking manual, some of the housekeeping changes that we're proposing that we did include with some strike-through and bolded language, one of which is expanding our downtown parking district boundary. We all know where downtown is, but to accommodate the area around the Center Point Apartments over on East Day and North Beach Street, we needed to make sure there was signage indicating where the parking was allowed, because again, most of us downtown, if we park, we know that we're going to get a ticket, and I know enforcement is done by our police department. Over the years, people will try to drive around the block face to try to avoid being ticketed. We all know of those stories. So we did want to incorporate and make sure that the boundary of the downtown was accurate, and with the small exception of this area around Center Point, we expanded that to bring it current. So again, downtown parking, we're typically seeing a $25 fine if you park too long in a parking spot in downtown and not rotate or move your vehicle, hopefully, to the parking garage. The snow routes, that was also included in the parking manual. Our Public Services Department oversees snow routes. We all know that we need to keep those downtown streets free and clear of vehicles so that the snow plows can get out in the wee hours of the morning and keep them plowed. But that goes not only for the downtown area, but all of Casper. We did choose to remove, I said we have several small changes. Some of these that are no longer around the school system and the school routes, because the school closures we removed from that list in the parking manual. So number 3 on our proposed changes talks about the removal around Jefferson School. We also have some of these streets now that were vacated and owned now by the school district around NC. So we are not responsible for those, so we took those off of our snowplow list. And then up near Mark's Way, up by Goodstein off of Casper Mountain Road, there's been enough activity and building out there that drifting has been more minimized, so we took that from a level A to a level B, and we removed that one from our snow route list. So those were some of the minimal changes. So you can start to see downtown parking, snow routes. Then we come into permitting. As we got into the permitting, and this is number 4 on the memo, we began to look at where do permits originate with our citizens. And what we have elected to do is to make it kind of a lot more streamlined. Permits will originate in our Public Services Department with the exception of RV permits. So in number 4, it talks about the engineering division will process, and you'll hear this here in a minute, which ones those are. RV permits for the time being will be in the city clerk's office. Eventually, when the police department gets linked in with Intergov, it'll transfer across the street with RVs. So we really looked at the permitting and streamlined that so people aren't having to stop in downstairs where they pay water bills and say, can I turn it in here? Or they're going to city manager's office and saying, hey, can I turn in my parking permit here? Or they're trying to turn it in perhaps over across the street at the police department. We've got it streamlined, and that will begin to be marketed more with Intergov as to where people turn these parking permits in for these special parking situations. Number 5, we have proposed as staff to actually with private handicap parking spaces to reduce the fee, which 10 years ago was set at $300 for a handicap parking space. We are recommending it be reduced to $50. Again, we feel that that is a hardship many times on our disabled community and felt that that was a little out of line. So that is one that we will be asking direction from all of you, is to honor that recommendation to make it more affordable. Again, there's a whole process to go through, obviously, with proof. It's not that any of us could just sign up for a handicap parking space, but when that is done, we're looking at a limited or reduced fee annually. Number 6, recreational vehicles. So this one, really was probably among the 10 of us that would get together, a big point of discussion, because again, I think a lot of us live on a street where we have RVs, or we have neighbors who choose to park their RVs on the street for the summer. And in the past, that's been a $25 annual fee. So you can park your RV on a city street pretty much most of the summer into the fall, and allow it to be there. Now, we had to begin to look at what the market out there is doing. What is the private sector doing to charge over at U-Haul or some of the other storage areas for parking in their economy? And we were seeing upwards of close to $750 to $800 for parking an RV or a boat, any form of a trailer at one of those lots. And so here we are as a city offering up a public street for $25 a year. So this became a discussion point amongst us as citizens to say, is that realistic? Also, is it realistic that I would go around to my neighbors and get signatures, because signatures are required from the neighbors to make sure that this is realistic and something the neighbors aren't going to mind having the RV on the street all summer. It was discussed that many times neighbors may be feeling that they have to sign a form or sign on the dotted line to support their fellow neighbor, when in fact maybe they aren't whoopee keen about having that RV parked on the street right next to their property all summer. So what we discussed as a team with point A and point B on this one is to look at raising the fee to park an RV on the city street from $25 for the summer season to $500. And again, we say per year for an annual permit. We do have currently that RVs are not allowed to be parked on a street longer than 5 days, which is definitely enforced. But we do feel that the ones that need to park it before they haul it out to the lakes or up to the mountains, that $500 would be more realistic. On point B with that, we have suggested that as opposed to neighbors going door to door to get signatures, that it is proposed that the community service officers will take on that task to make the contact and obtain the signatures when an application is submitted. So again, through this process, application is submitted, then at that point it triggers, the clerk enters the application, it then triggers the police department to have a CSO go out and make contact to see if in fact this RV permit is in fact warranted and approved by the neighborhood. So that is another change that we're looking at within the permitting situation. Point number 7, the fee structure for critical parking and school parking permits is proposed to change slightly. Currently, we have this $2 per day cost of these temporary parking permits around the school and the critical parking area for use by visitors. So again, if we wanted to visit a school and we're asked to and park there, maybe, I don't want to say we're a substitute teacher, but maybe we're there for a period of time, maybe teaching. It's a $2 per day cost. We have not seen citizens utilize this provision in the past, and so this is one that we are reducing down. We'll still have critical parking around schools, but having a fee charged for that would be taken away for that per day cost. I'm going to skip number 8, which is parkway parking, and we're going to jump down to number 9, which temporary special need parking permits. On number 9, very similar to private handicap permits, and staff proposes to remove them from the parking manual and basically consolidate any kind of this special needs parking under the private handicap parking that we talked about with point number 4. So a lot of different types of parking, and citizens would say, well, what's the difference between this one and this one? And many times might fill out the incorrect one and be trying to provide proof to us. So we're trying to make it, again, easier for the citizen. If they've got a disability, whether it's temporary based on a surgical procedure or a permanent handicap situation, again, we're looking at consolidating those all under the private handicap parking, and again, the fee reduction down to $50 a year. Number 10, construction parking permits. typically allow for parking in excess of 2 hours in the downtown business when construction is occurring. Staff has proposed removing this permit type as well from the parking manual. It's really never been utilized in the past. I know we've all seen construction occurring in the downtown core. We usually are working from asking for staging areas when we know construction is going to happen, whether it's the building division or our public services division. We try to accommodate that temporary construction. If we need to, we can have a temporary street closure permit, but having somebody pull a construction parking permit, we did not feel was warranted because it's, again, one that has not typically been used. We get the phone call, we accommodate them between our groups internally. So again, if there's a sidewalk going in outside of backwards distilling and they need a ramp, we accommodate that for a short period of time instead of having the property owner have to pull a construction parking permit. So that was another one we asked to have removed from the parking manual. And then number 11, the removal of courtesy parking tickets and permits. Again, one of those, I bet you all didn't know this existed out there, but if we have out-of-county, out-of-state guests in town, they are allowed to say, hey, we would like a special permit to park on a Casper street. And again, that has not typically been utilized. It was something in the past that the Chamber of Commerce, Convention and Visitors Bureau had suggested, but we have a phenomenal parking garage now that we do try to direct our guests and visitors to and utilize that. So this special ticket and permit was something that has not been utilized in past on this form that I alluded to earlier. So we are looking at consolidating it down again to the handicap component very much, as well as the RV process would probably be the two biggest. And in the new manual, we had outlined, in fact, what the reduced or shortened application form would look like. And again, the directions are much clearer on where the form originates from. So it'll be posted on the website, and then if you have a need for a handicap parking permit, critical parking, you would approach the engineering office. If you wanted to get an RV permit for the summer, you'd go to the city clerk. So much more streamlined than it has been in the past, because we were really all over the place. And again, we want to make it simpler for our citizens, and that's where I am with actually the manual and those permits. So I'll pause and see if there's some questions related before we get into actually parking on the parkways.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you. Thanks, and I certainly don't want to undermine the hard work you folks did. There's obviously been a lot of work done here.
Yes.
Just a couple questions. One, if we're gonna, I think you called it a handicap or a hardship reduction to bring the handicap prices down to $25.
Yes.
Why are we charging them at all? Why don't we make that money up on tickets on people that are parking in places they shouldn't be? It just seems to me that if it's a hardship, it's a hardship. So $25 to me seems, I don't understand why we're charging at all for those. It's just my opinion. And secondly, when it comes to the recreational vehicles, they're already paying more for their plates, they're paying more road tax, they're paying more fuel tax, and now we're gonna up them $475, so we're kind of picking on the wealthier people, I guess, and I for one am against that as well. So I just wanted to make sure both of those comments are put out there for you.
I would, Your Honor, I know that we do have a fee associated with the handicap because there is the production of the sign. So just so you all know, that is something that the city does install when there is the request for handicap sign.
Will the $25 cover that?
I'm going to turn to my public services director.
No? So whether we charge 25 or we don't, it really doesn't matter much, does it, Mr. Becker?
Beamer.
Or Beamer, excuse me,
Yeah.
Andrew?
No, there's still
Mr. Andrew?
Mayor, Councilman, I'll respond to lots of different names. The handicap parking spot is specific to that handicap user. It's not a handicap parking spot that anybody with a handicap placard can park in. So that's one of the justifications, I think, for the $25 annual fee, or I think it's 50.
50.
50, proposed 50. And you're right, there is a cost for our staff to go out there and actually physically put up the sign with the handicap placard, with the actual number that is exclusive to that one handicap applicant, but it does not cover the cost to actually go out there and physically produce a sign.
Right, because they're already paid by tax money, right? Those people going out to do that?
It's a cost that we cover internally through the general fund, that's correct.
Councilwoman Ingebrigtsen.
I just had a question about the RV parking. You'd said for the summer months, or if they paid for the yearly. So is there going to be, say, from April 1st to October 1st? Is there going to be a timeline, or they just pay $500 and they can always be on the street?
We typically, Your Honor, sorry. We typically do ask for the RVs to be removed from the streets for the winter season. And that, again, is typically October. I'm looking at code enforcement through April? Typically, yes, for snow. For snow. So even though we say it's an annual fee, yes, it's not for they're not allowed to park on the street through the winter months.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Liz, for the presentation. I guess to second what Councilman Nell said, I was surprised to see that the cost was so high for the handicap parking permits. You said that was set 10 years ago, and I guess I'd just be curious. I love having context. So whatever that discussion was 10 years ago to set that rate, I'd be curious to know what information went into that decision. And then also if there's been any sort of analysis done to determine how much the city generates from those permits currently. So what the current revenue is, what would be lost, should we decide to reduce it. And then same goes for RV. I don't know if any analysis has been done to determine how many of those permits we would expect to, have be applied. Thank you.
Excellent questions. And we bring in approximately $4,000 in combined parking permit revenue each year. Okay, so then the questions that Councilman Gamroth asked, how many are the RV? And again, we are trying to encourage and follow up on that as far as the enforcement goes. It's again, you're looking at a $25 fee, and a lot of times people are moving those RVs every 5 days. So even though they may be considered as being stored, it's sometimes a hard component to enforce. The number is surprisingly low on the RV count. Most of our parking permit revenue that might come from some of the handicap spots or parking in our city, some of our city lots that we have around town, that's where the permit revenue comes from. But overall, we're talking $4,000. So, okay. Does that answer it close enough?
Yeah, thank you.
There are probably, Amber, were we close to like 10 to 15 on the RVs, if that?
And it's not just RVs, it's any trailer. So
Sure.
not to interject.
No, that's fine.
It's regarding RV parking permit, or the RV permitting process is for any trailer, boat, camper, horse trailer, jet skis, anything that stays on the street.
But it was close to about 10 to 15 on the count that we have done in the past.
Any other questions?
Easy.
Councilwoman Lutz.
Sorry. Hey, Liz. So yeah, on the RVs, I mean, in theory, somebody could have their RV parked, out front of their house on the street for the most part for the entire summer, as long as they moved it every 5 days. Is that correct?
Your Honor, yes.
Dang it. And like you said, it's hard to monitor that, because that's the only thing is, I think we would all agree that when you live in a neighborhood, especially some of these newer neighborhoods with the narrow streets, it really is wildly inconvenient when you have, a 40-foot camper parked outside in front of somebody's street. I would imagine it makes it difficult for sanitation to pick up trash cans and work around them. It obviously is kind of a blight, I guess is the right word, on the neighborhood. But I definitely can see the challenge of enforcing that. So I think that I love the sentiment behind it, but I definitely worry about how much we can actually see that realized.
Chief?
Thank you for the opportunity to address council, even though a question wasn't asked of me. A great deal of thought went into this fee structure, and what we intended to do was to divest ourselves from those who want an accommodation versus those that need an accommodation. So that handicapped person that has significant mobility issues, we wanted to be able to accommodate them for a need versus those that want, through a matter of convenience, a permit that just makes life simpler for them. And so that's why we've proposed this very much a reduced fee structure for those that need it. It's not going to meet our costs. That's not the point. We want to reduce those costs for them. But for those that want, for matters of convenience or because it's economically judicious for them to use that service, we wanted to get that up to the more appropriate level. So we definitely tried to separate the needs from the wants.
No, go ahead. First, Councilman Gamros.
Thank you. I guess to piggyback off of what Councilwoman Lutz was saying, and I guess what Liz had said, only 10 to 15 of those permits had been applied for, and I'm sure there's hundreds of people parking like that. And so I guess that would be my question to you is, how do you go about enforcing that or tracking that? Or thank you.
Mayor and Councilman, that's an excellent question. Right now, we are predominantly driven by citizen contact. When people call us up and say, I'm getting tired of this, can you come take a look at it? That's when we do that. In conjunction with all of the cases, when we attempt to bring changes forward on our procedures, we include with that a heavy marketing campaign. The police department, the city, we all have a pretty good platform for getting that information out. As is always the case, we look for compliance rather than enforcement. And the best way for us to get compliance is through education and information getting out. So right now we respond to complaints or when things are so egregious that we can't, that somebody sees it and we got to take action. But for the most part, the complaints we get is, hey, this thing's been parked here, it's blocking the sidewalk, the kids gotta walk around it, they gotta go into the street, or this thing's been parked out there forever, I can't even see the stop sign now, somebody's gonna get hurt. That's when we get involved in it. Oftentimes when we undertake programs such as this, we're attempting to prevent problems in advance rather than just responding to them.
I guess I have two real quick questions. Liz, did you say the temporary special needs that was going to fall underneath handicap? So if a person, and I'm assuming temporary special needs is somebody that maybe had back surgery or something and maybe for a month period of time or whatever, they would need to have that parking. So is the cost going to be the same? And if it is the same, then is it going to remain for, could they keep it for a year, even if they only needed it for a month, or how is that going to work?
So, Mayor, Council, what I would believe would be the intent of that is it's temporary in nature. So it would list as long as their medical provider has provided them with that handicap parking authorization. So it would not be our intent for that to be a year-long thing.
But at this point, the fee would be a $25 application fee and then the $50 fee. Now, whether we did try to do some offsetting, we haven't discussed that.
Okay. And I guess the way I'm looking at it is if somebody wanted to, they could be over their illness within a month, but they could still milk it out for another 11 months having a nice place to park if they wanted to, because they're paying the same amount that somebody else would pay for an annual fee.
Mayor, again, much of this, we're waiting for direction from council. So, you know, forgive me if I sound like I'm making it up as I go along, but in this case, I believe it is our intent that when somebody is given because they broke their leg in an industrial accident, their doctor provides them with documentation of here's your blue hanger, but that doesn't last forever. It's not valid next year when their leg is now healed. So under the goal of this would be to provide them the temporary authorization for the time that is needed. And that would be the time that their medical provider has authorized them to essentially take advantage of handicap parking opportunities. And so it would not be our intent for them to milk it to now have their personal private parking space when they're no longer in need of that private personal parking space.
And I guess the reason I'm asking that question is exactly that, is to kind of flush this out as we go along. If we're charging somebody $50 annually, but somebody only needs it for a month period of time, does it really warrant a $50 fee for them in order to have a temporary 1 month parking space? I'm just asking the question to get it right. And then the other question for you, Chief, do we still have, and this is just for information only, but is it on the snow routes downtown, are we still 3 a.m. All cars out of the downtown area for clearing?
Mayor, Your Honor, we haven't declared a snow emergency in probably 20 years in this community, just because of political fallback from towing people when they don't move off the streets.
You know, Mayor, my recollection was 2 a.m., but I may be wrong.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if it was still there. I don't remember if it was 2 or 3, but I know that there was a certain time that when the snow was falling, cars had to be out of the downtown area so they could clear them for business the next day. Okay. Councilman Allen, then I'll come back to you.
Chief, what is this, so they're suggesting now, instead of having the individual go through the neighborhood and get signatures and the problems that come along with that, they're talking about having your department do that? What's that going to do to your budget? What's it going to do to your time? Do you have the time and the budget to send people out to knock on neighbors' doors to find out if we could park an RV in a specific area?
Mayor and Councilman, no, that's a very good question, and it is something that we've discussed. This is an additional demand on our resources, but there are significant concerns with the efficacy of having a neighbor. You know, let's say that in my neighborhood, I want to park my boat out in front of my house. I don't want to store it down at a private place. I want to just have it convenient to me. And so the current process is we pick up the form, and then I go around to my neighbors and, hey, Bob, Susie, how's it going? You know, really great to see you. You know, hey, by the way, I want to park my boat here. Please sign this to allow me to do that. Well, oftentimes those neighbors they want to be good neighbors. They want to be good neighbors. They don't want to start a row, and so they willingly sign that because they just don't want to. They're put on the spot and they don't want to be that neighbor. Privately inside, they're like, boy, my kids are riding bikes on the street and they've crashed into the impeller blades a couple of times. We don't really want that. The second thing is I'm particularly sensitive to having people go knock on doors and they don't really know who's going to be answering the door. And so I think it's improper for us to put the onus on these citizens to go do these things for those listed reasons. I don't think it's fair to kind of extort the neighbors into complying with my wishes. But more importantly, I don't want them knocking on the door of somebody who's in the middle of a schizophrenic episode who believes that their neighbor is now an agent of the CIA. And so for those reasons, I'm recommending that we send at least people that are a little bit more trained and have access to data that may say, hey, it's not safe to do that at this particular address. You've asked me a very relevant question on how's that impact my budget? And as we proceed further down this discussion, it has a very real opportunity to impact the budget and the staffing requirements that I need. to do this. Currently, the numbers that we're doing of people that are seeking these permits does not rise to the level of causing me a high degree of angst. If the numbers stay the same, I am not coming to the city manager and saying, hey, you put this onus on me, now I need another FTE to meet that. We're not there. If in the future that it does rise to that, then that's a discussion that would be held in the future. Currently, I don't anticipate it. Some of the further discussion we need to have tonight may lead to this very same topic, and that one may be altogether different.
Councilmember Pollock.
Just in reflecting on what Mayor Friel said about the cost remaining the same regardless of if the permit is temporary in nature or more like an annual permit. For me, it seems some of the philosophy behind the permit is just, or the fee is just to help us offset some of the cost of processing the request and posting the signage, right? And that process and posting is the same, whether it lasts for the entire year or somebody just needs it for a month, correct? The cost of the city would be relatively similar between those two. It's not as if they're renting a spot by the day. It's more to pay for, to offset some of the cost of the process to get the spot established in the first place.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
I have a little bit of an issue of something that I don't think is even being mentioned here. I've talked to Carter Napier a little bit about this, but we have homes throughout the city that you have residents that have 10 to 20 vehicles parked up and down the street. And it's owned by one person. Most of them are not really running, they're kind of broke down, but they do keep the plates current, so it keeps the city off of them. And so, you know, I would like to see something to where we could deal with this, because, you know, you have neighborhoods to where people cannot get to their homes. They're walking blocks to get to their homes because you have one individual that's got 20 cars up and down the street. And so it's whether or not you can do a conditional parking, or if we need to just say, okay, you can have X number of vehicles on the street, and then if you need, say, 2 more, you have to get a permit. But we have throughout the city in different areas people who are absolutely congesting the streets beyond congesting, and we need to address this.
Mayor, Councilwoman, these are great points. Council has previously to this undertaken some of that topic. So recently we have firmed up our enforcement ability for the person that had the loophole, that was taking advantage of the loophole, sitting on 4 rims, no rubber to be seen, and got a Siberian elm tree growing up through the hood, but it was currently licensed. We've addressed that already, so we're making significant progress in the last and during this last calendar year. We've removed a lot of those off of the streets, trying to reduce that situation where people were just occupying the streets, and you could see the trough of the street sweeper as they had to go around. It was leaving a furrow of debris on the path because it had been there so long. We've done a really good job of addressing that. I'm sure there's some out there that haven't risen to our attention, but we have removed a ton of those. So when it comes to the citizen that owns a large number of vehicles and is lawfully parking them in the neighborhood, if that's something that council wants to give us some direction on, we would be happy to present that back to you and make those changes.
I've tried to go, I have a rental in a neighborhood, and I have tried every single way possible to just have access to this property, and we can't. We just can't have access to this home. And so, and then as driving around and then talking to other people, there's a couple of other areas that this is actually a problem with. So I think that there's still enough of a loophole that we still need to kind of close that gap a little bit.
Chief?
Mayor and Councilwoman, Absolutely, you know, I freely acknowledge there's people that own 12 cars. You know, so that currently it's not addressed in our ordinances. But if that's a recommendation, we can certainly look at that.
Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, part 2, parking on the parkways. Point number 8 in the council memo talked about, again, as Carter Napier, City Manager Napier had mentioned, our current regulations do prohibit parking in the parkways. And under council's direction for the past several years, this regulation has not been actively enforced. Most recently in 2017, we did go out, combination of police and code enforcement, and did citations in 2017 May along 12th and 13th Street, and issued 50 citations. Had a lot of angst, some appreciation, but a lot of angst on that exercise, and council at the time said, okay, but do not enforce it. So we backed off from that in 2017. Parkways are city-owned. They are homeowner maintained. We see well-maintained parkways. We see some that are not. Again, the purpose of the parkways has traditionally been aesthetic, but again, we look at the fact that homeowners have begun to use them for storage of vehicles, as we've just been talking about. Even if it's temporary, if they don't have a driveway or a back alley, they do become a source of additional property that the homeowners can use. Again, it's supposed to be a buffer, but we do see the vehicles on the parkways all over Casper. In 2017, the arguments against parking on the parkways were very much voiced on the aesthetics. And we heard from not only the Planning Commissioner representatives came to the 2017 council and said this is contrary to our comprehensive land use plan that we have in place. This should not be utilized. It is not appropriate land use. Brooke Kaufman came from the Convention and Visitors Bureau, said that she also was recommending against that because, again, aesthetics of trying to promote our downtown residential areas and having vehicles parked along them was not as well, I guess, did not look as well. We have seen preservation of trees become an issue along the parkways. Again, most of them initially were planted with trees. Over time, the homeowners, many have taken the trees down in order to put gravel or concrete over them or just leave the mud. As staff, we have watched the curbs erode over time and the street damage, whether it be from dirt and concrete that gets pulled out into the pathway. So we do see some issues that way. Again, with stormwater damage issues were brought up in 2017. Encroachment and safety are mentioned also in the council memo because of the sight distance issues caused by trying to pull out from a side street, 12th and 13th, and trying to view around the vehicles that are parked on the parkways. And again, we're looking at about a 10-foot minimum widths on that, so you can have some pretty big vehicles parked on those parkways and still be allowed. So those were the arguments against allowing parking on the parkways. We do acknowledge, as we've said here, that there are legitimate points on both sides of the house of this issue. But again, from a staff standpoint, we had stopped enforcing because of the direction in 2017. Parkways are a chapter in this parking manual, so we do want to get direction from this council to know what to put into the parking manual. We have, as staff, identified 3 possible options, and we're asking for direction from council on these. So on the 3rd page of our council memo, it talks about always allowing parking within the parkways. And again, that would be really without a permit, just let it happen. Letter number 2, never allow parking within the parkways. And again, that's the current ordinance. No permits would be issued. It would just be citations penalizing the vehicles and the homeowners that park there. And third is the option is to allow parking on the parkways only with the issuance or approval of a parking permit. And again, that would be really on the job of our community service officers and police officers to begin to patrol that to make sure that there's the parking permits on the vehicles that are parked on there. I'm going to ask Amanda just to pull up a visual. We had put this into the council packet. Our police department went out with the CSOs and did an inventory along primarily 12th and 13th Street. They identified, and again, this was one point in time, but they did a snapshot of the vehicles that were parked on the parkways. And again, a lot of the vehicles go in the daytime to work and then they come back in the evening. So this was during the day that this inventory was captured at one point in time. But what we wanted to show was, again, the types of vehicles that we do see on the parkways along 12th and 13th Street. Again, we have parkways all over Casper. McKinley Street, for instance, has quite a bit, and that's where initially this discussion had also arisen. With our planning commission was about McKinley Street. But tonight we went ahead and put up 12th and 13th Street as a sampling. So what I outlined in in our memo was if we do elect to go with the third option, which is parking on the parkways with a parking permit, then we do suggest the following changes. Currently RVs can park on the parkways for $25 a year. We're back to that kind of discussion. Vehicles, what are allowed to park on the parkway typically would be a $15 fee, but again, the RVs currently are sitting at $25. A reduced fee may be warranted for standard vehicles, and that's what we came around with the $15. But rather than have the applicant obtain approvals and signatures from the adjacent property owners, again, staff is suggesting that the CSOs are going to be the ones that need to go out and ask the neighbors along the parkway, do you mind if this individual gets a permit to park their vehicle on that parkway? So there would have to be an approval process vetted by our police department, and we all know that would probably include some larger staff time. So we've put these options together again. Allow it, no permits, just let it happen. Don't allow it, and perhaps get back into enforcement if that's what the council would like to see. Or again, allow it with a parking permit, but we would ask that you reconsider the costs of what that permit might be to park on the parkways. So that's probably the big question of tonight, and that we would like to seek some direction on.
Chief?
Thank you. I just wanted to add in the public safety aspects of parking on the parkway. The intent of those parkways originally was to increase the sight distance, so as you're traveling through a residential area that you have the opportunity to, in addition to the cars lawfully parked on the side of the road, that you have the ability to see children playing, pets, things in the yards, and those potential hazards as they're approaching the roadway, rather than as being as a surprise. If I could call your attention to the two photos in the upper right-hand corner, is the second part of that. Parking on the parkway presents an unusual circumstance wherein a person can lawfully park on the side of the road right there. And then I'm being summoned to referee, hey, I need to get my car out, and this person's parked here lawfully on the side of the road. It poses problems to it. It could be argued that their cars are safer parked on the parkway, but I would argue that those cars entering from in a diagonal way into the roadway are much more likely to become, if they did not clear that it's also going to generate crashes in its own right. This is safer than backing out of a driveway. I will grant you that. You have a better sight distance, but it's the amount of degree people are actually paying attention when they're backing out. They're looking to make sure that they can do that, whereas, just driving diagonally off of your parkway into the roadway lane of travel, people are a little bit more complacent with that. So I think there are some public safety considerations on this, but primarily my concern is losing that sight distance of things that are happening, that are approaching the roadway, and so that our motorists are not caught off guard by that ball, that dog, that cat, that child.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
And that kind of leads to my question. I don't know how difficult it would be for you guys, but would it be something of a negotiation to say cars and maybe small SUVs can be on the parkway without a permit, but then a truck, because we can get some pretty big trucks that maybe would need to be permitted and have some permission, because, I mean, a small car you can see around, but, a huge truck is going to be something a little bit more difficult to see around.
Mayor, Councilwoman, these are excellent points. From the logistics of ease of operations, arguing with people over whether or not theirs meets, the specific criteria. My goal would be to try to reduce loopholes wherever I could, so that people don't take advantage of that, and we don't engage in debates on the side of the roadway. That usually doesn't go well for us. For prosecutorial purposes, that also creates problems for us if we limit it in ways of, well, this is it's a minivan, but it's a large, it's a panel van, it's not a truck, and I want to avoid those type of situations. Trailers is a good example of ones that are particularly problematic. There's something about a trailer, an unhitched trailer, that just becomes a magnet for bicycles and pedestrians and impacts to happen with that. It's because the mind does not interpret it the same way that we do a full-size motor vehicle, and so those chronically get crashed into by kids on bicycles and just kids running, because their mind doesn't process that trailer the same way. They're far more dangerous than any other vehicle, and yet they have the best sight allowances of any of them, but they're the ones that get more crashes into them than anything else.
Councilman Gamera.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief and Liz, again for the testimony for this issue. I totally agree with many of those points, the aesthetics, the public safety and stuff. But I do remember being at one of those hearings and remember hearing Chad Lohr spoke, and I think it was the only time I've ever seen a standing ovation for somebody at a city council meeting. Part of that's just because he's a great entertainer, but I think the other part was because he had a lot of people empathizing with his situation. For the people that weren't aware, was trying, he's a musician, so he's unloading equipment from his vehicle with his family, and those narrow streets, I gotta admit, the times when I have to park on them to go over to a friend's house or go to a function or something like that, it scares me getting out of my car on some of those narrower streets, just because there's so little clearance, so little room to park. So I guess to make sure that we're being equitable, being fair to the people that live on these parkways who would like to maybe potentially utilize this space. I'd be curious to know, have we done any sort of surveying of the people that live in these areas that have these parkways, and/or is there any way for us to get, you mentioned crashes, people coming out of there diagonally. I'd be curious to know currently what the property damage is on 12th and 13th. Come to mind, those long, straight, narrow streets. I'd be curious to know if those folks have a lot of issue with property damage from people sideswiping their cars and stuff. Thank you.
Mayor, in regards to a survey, we have not undertaken a citywide survey. The people on one street are going to feel different about this than people on another street. And so that is something that we have not undertaken. We believe in our hearts that this is a subject that is passionate to people on both sides of the spectrum. When it comes to crash data, I did provide to council just a few weeks ago data that was very specifically, narrowly addressing these impacts that occurred with a parked vehicle on the side of the road. They do happen, but the frequency of those is not so much that it rises to a high level of enforcement. So if you remember the strict math of it, for example, was on 12th Street, I looked at just 40 feet shy of 1 mile of 12th Street roadway, and in an entire, I'm going from memory, I want to say there were 11 crashes in one or 2 years in there. But when I took a very strict interpretation of the math, for every 700, I'm going from memory, 780,000 miles driven on that roadway, we would have one crash into a parked car. The vast majority of those happen to be, hey, the offending vehicle's mirror struck their car, or my parked car, its driver's side mirror got sideswiped. There are times when especially the DUI driver, they tend to cause a more severe crash. But that's not a function of the roadway, that's a function of the driving behavior. So those crashes do happen. I gave you data for 12th Street and 13th Street, and it averaged to less than once a month for both 12th and 13th Street combined. And there we have, and I looked at that in a 2-year window. But there, on 12th Street alone, more than 8 million miles are driven every year on 12th Street. And so 12th Street and 13th Street are both phenomenal, effective movers of traffic. Those roadways are highly effective. A lot of vehicles travel those roadways every day. It's absolutely astonishing how many vehicles do it. And by far and away, when you really look at the math, they're very safe roadways.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thank you. Yes, to me, this is complicated because I think it's easy to see both points, but I do feel like this is not a novel issue to our community. So I'm curious, what's the norm? What's the standard? What do we know about outcomes of different interpretations and different strategies for this in different communities? Because, I mean, I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. To me, it seems like there's probably a sort of a standard way of handling this, or close to it, a consensus around like what is the best way to do this in a community.
Mayor, Councilwoman, great comment. I have not done the research on a meaningful survey. However, I can speak anecdotally. I have lived in X amount of communities, and this is the only one that I've been a vehicle owning or vehicle driving person that exists. Most communities, in my opinion, outright prohibit it. Yeah.
I would agree. In the places where I have lived also, it has been prohibited. No, sir, we have not done a survey.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have several things going through my brain, so you're going to have to bear with me. The first thing is, I brought this issue up, I think, the very first day I came on council, because a lot of the constituents on 12th and 13th reached out to me before I even got elected. I live on arguably the skinniest street in this town, and if we didn't park up on the parkways, you'd have an accident or 3 or 4 every single day. And if you look at these pictures on 11th and 12th, your statistics really aren't realistic at all. Because if people weren't parked on the parkways like this, and you had them on both sides of the street on 12th in the regulated area, you'd have a hell of a lot more accidents than we have now, because we've already got a bunch with mirrors and side swipes and everything else. So if we take parkway parking away and we allow everybody to park on the street legally the way they're supposed to, and you have 2 lanes of traffic going down 12th or 13th, not going to happen. Not going to happen without accidents over and over and over again. So my thinking is no unmotorized vehicles, no trailers, no RVs, nobody within 150 feet of the corner, which Andrew and I have discussed. And those that do want to park on that parkway that are dragging dirt and rocks and everything else out into the street, creating even more of a hazard, at their expense, allow them to pave the area between the sidewalk and the street, which damn near everybody on my street's already done. And, I mean, we just have, you're not going down that street if you don't have vehicles up on the parkway a little bit. And as far as it being unsafe, I disagree. It's no less safe than if you have cars lined down both sides of 12th. You're not gonna see a kid coming. You're not gonna see a ball coming. At least if they're back a little bit, you've got more of a view to be able to see than if they're right there on the street. And I've driven it since these constituents got a hold of me. I've driven it 100 times. And there are spots where people do park on both sides, and you're not getting two cars through there. Not in my dually, not without me hitting something or somebody. It's just, for the safety of our citizens, I'm worried less about the aesthetics than I am the safety of our people. And aesthetically, if we, and this would have to be a case-by-case situation where you go and look, we're not gonna let them cut out a tree so they can park their car there. That's ridiculous. If they have a beautifully manicured and they take care of their place, that's a whole nother story. But a lot of these places up through here are just dirt, ragged, they're parking up on them, and of course they are dragging that stuff down. So my thought is, it's up to the homeowner to take care of that. So if we allow them to beautify, that particular area and have concrete put in there, I just don't see the harm in it. And I told those people I'd fight for it because I believe in it. And that's kind of where I'm at on the deal. And if you ever want an example, drive down Cedar Street, you'll see most of those places are paved. And if the cars weren't up there, it'd be accident city every day, all day. So.
Chief?
Mayor, thank you. Councilman, those are great points, and I want to, full disclosure, you're absolutely correct. This data that I have is from the years 2019 and 2020, when people were parking on the side streets. So when I'm talking about the reduced visibility, that's when we're allowing parking and parking on the parkway. That combined thing, that, in my opinion, that definitely reduces visibility. If, you've discussed some of the things that your staff committee has absolutely gone over those. If council wants to move that way, perhaps they can consider specific roadways that are appropriate for this. And with that consideration, if council wanted to put restrictions on it, it must be a solid surface rather than in our opinion, the rutted, muddy ones, that they've been parking on it, they've killed the vegetation, it gets soupy in the snow and the rain, and they bring all that out, and now that's going into our stormwater. Our street cleaners are going to have to pick up after that. I think those are the things that we're seeking guidance from this council on. What exactly do you want to do? We would say that it may not be appropriate for every roadway in our community. There may be some that it is appropriate with reasonable conditions applied to it.
And I am 100% in agreement with you. And that was my thought from the beginning. There's only certain streets that this is applicable, like Cedar Street or even Chestnut, which most of those homes, it's beautifully manicured and they're not gonna wanna do that. So it's gonna be a case-by-case thing. But I can guarantee on 12th and 13th, you're gonna have a lot of people take you up on it. At their expense, they're gonna, and I would say you can only park there if it's a hard surface. If you've, spent the money, taking care of it, made it look nice, and then again, only one car. I don't think you can have two of them there, because then I think you are asking for a ton of trouble. So if there's already a car in the parkway, you can't park beside it on the street. And the idea for me is getting the cars off the street to make it safer for everybody. You said 8 million miles a year we're putting on that roadway, and if we take away parkway parking, we're gonna have a whole lot of accidents. That's just my opinion. So I'm with you. I absolutely agree with you. I think it should be a case-by-case deal, and I think there should be provisions in place as far as the size of the vehicle and the surface and everything else. So, thank you.
Councilman Kathy.
The one thing that I wanted to bring up is those streets, primarily, well, the streets you're talking about downtown and 12th and 13th were put in back, in the 60s, 70s, or even earlier than that. I had an 88 Ford Dually, and it used to fit into my garage widthwise. It was long enough, it always fit, but widthwise, it would go in without having to worry about mirrors. And it was on like a 9-foot door. Today's truck, even before I got the dually that I drive now, with the 11s, it would not go into that same door without having to fold the mirrors in. So in the last 30 years, vehicles, and your primary comment was it's mirrors being knocked off. And yeah, when I drive down now 12th or 13th, I'm constantly watching who's got a mirror still left out, because I know mine's out, and I have to be extremely careful or I can wipe out a bunch of mirrors in a heartbeat. But the other thing that concerns me as well about the parking on the parkways is there is a particular pickup that sits on 12th Street, and there is a black or navy blue vehicle that sits on 13th Street, that they actually leave their part of their vehicle hanging out into that parking area, and it's all the way across the sidewalk. That worries me as much as anything else as well. And those are two instances that aren't just a one-time deal. These are constantly the way they are parked there. So I think that's something that we need to address as well.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thank you. I guess you guys give us three options, but I guess maybe I can put the manager on the spot. What is the staff's recommendation on something like this?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, were the conditions more perfect, we would say not to allow parkways to be used as parking lots. I think there's a lot of good reason for it. I think a lot of people have front yards that ordinances allow for vehicles to be stored in. I don't view that as ideal either, but nonetheless, that is private property and it is space that's available. But, you know, with regard to options to consider with respect to sort of a compromise position, and I'm not so sure I'd like, don't like those either. I think those are some good compromise options to consider. Staff would certainly not recommend that any parkway everywhere is available or sort of a free-for-all, if you will. And so if we do move forward, we definitely would recommend that it be done so in a manner that has limitations and guidelines associated.
Councilmember Pollack.
So, for me, the driving factor is safety, I think, over aesthetics, over anything else. And I grew up on 13th Street, very busy intersection. I think we probably personally had 3 cars hit just in that spot alone. So I know it will be problematic in some areas, but now I am also, so to me it seems in my mind safer, but I'm also hearing that there are safety concerns about people parking on the parkways that I'm not necessarily familiar with and can't as easily conceptualize as the clear safety concern about people being on a crowded street. So whether it's right now or whether it's a follow-up to this, if there's some information that exists about what are the safety concerns of allowing parking on the parkway that I can get a little bit more information on, I would appreciate that. To me, that is what would drive my decision.
Chief.
Mayor, Council, I want to be circumspect in what I'm about to say, because hard data is going to be very hard for me to come by, because we have by an informal policy not been enforcing it. So when it came to a pedestrian crash, we may not have been involved in determining, hey, did a car parked on the parkway play a role in this? So I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to provide concrete data over this 5-year window. We know these safety things occurred, because we wouldn't have been looking at it through that lens. We do have the ability to come with just professional experience of given the fact of this roadway. You're going to hear probably already a dozen times from Andrew and I the concept of the 85th percentile. And so we look for things that are anomalies in that 85th percentile. Much of the roadways that we're discussing tonight, they are solidly within that window of ideal circumstances, so they don't rise to the level of, we have an engineering concern. We could make a lot of this go away by reducing 12th and 13th Street to one lane. Then we're not even having this discussion, but then we have the complaint of, now I have traffic jams, and it used to take me 10 minutes to get to work, now it takes me 25. And so, there's a lot of factors that go into this. I just want to be very cautious about promising that I can produce relevant data on things that we weren't making or retaining that data for that purpose.
If I could I guess I have one question and then I have a suggestion. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just had a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
So I was raised on 5th and McKinley, and right at the bottom of that hill. And it wasn't an 85%, it was 100%. Every single year, all of our vehicles got hit all the time. It was a constant thing. So we had to always carry full coverage insurance, and then people would hit it so hard that it actually took out some trees, until the city finally allowed us to just make a piece of that parkway so that we could get up off of the street. Once that was allowed, 100% of those accidents stopped. Just because of the snowstorm, you got the stoplight, you got the hill, it was a recipe for disaster. So growing up, every year we had cars in the lawns all winter long, all the time. And so living through that, I know that it did help by us getting the vehicles off of a snowy, icy road. And then our vehicles didn't get crashed into anymore. So I am for maybe allowing 12th and 13th to do parkways, and just because of how busy those roads are, and not allow the rest of the city, but that would be deferred to everybody else.
Chief?
Thank you, Mayor, for the opportunity to respond to that. I just, I too grew up in a northern clime. We too lived at the intersection at the bottom of the hill, so I can absolutely empathize with what you're saying. I have personal experience with that. Unfortunately, we have, the quality of vehicles has greatly improved. The anti-lock brakes has been a significant factor. That's why, our roadways are far more safer than they were all those times ago. So those unique circumstances, I want to convey that the police department works directly with Andrew's team to determine, is the roadway correctly engineered? Is roadway design a function or a factor in causing these crashes? And we're well habituated to looking at what are the underlying causes of these crashes, and we move to address that. So if it needs to be a difference in striping, a difference in signage, a difference in lighting, we're very habituated to go into Andrew. We look at it as a team and try to identify those areas that we can make a difference. So we are the beneficiaries of significant motor vehicle improvements. Those anti-lock brakes has really changed the game on people going downhill like that, approaching an intersection. So,
You're not telling me I'm old, are you? You're not saying that, right?
I was just sitting here thinking this.
what you heard me say was that I empathize with you.
Okay, the only thing that I wanted to say, and this would have to do with if this were to move forward on parking on the parkways, but then also with the RV permits that get put out. Maybe it's a reverse way of thinking, but I find it ironic that if somebody wants a permit, they have to get permission from the people around them, whether or not they can have that. And it just seems to me, tedious as can be, to put that back onto the CSOs or onto law enforcement to go knocking on doors to ask people's permission. And at the end of the day, we all know that you may have a neighbor on one side or the other that doesn't like you, that may just flat out say, no, they can't have it. I don't want them to have it, and your fate's in their hand, which seems ridiculous to me. So I guess reverse way of thinking, I'd rather see it to where we don't task the police department in knocking on doors. If people want to apply for a permit, they can, unless there's some legal reason why we can't go this route. But if they want to apply for a permit, allow them to do so. And if somebody has an issue at that point in time, they can come down and state the reason why. And it can't be not an issue of, basically I don't like my neighbor. give me an issue that says, hey, every time I back out of my driveway, that RV's blocking my view and I'm afraid I'm gonna get hit. If it's a legitimate reason, then at that point in time, you can say, hey, and people would need to understand that when you apply for the permit, you could have somebody that would want to come and contest you having that permit. But I'd rather see it go that route than spend all these hours of sending officers and community service officers knocking on doors, getting people's permission for people to have a permit. If there is a legitimate reason as to why they shouldn't have it, a safety reason why they shouldn't have it, then at that point in time, they should be able to bring that up. That's my thought on that. I don't know if you want to respond to that or not, but.
So Mayor, thank you. I'm all for not increasing the man hours to go do things like this. So I'm acutely sensitive to the workload of what we're trying to accomplish with our community service officer position. We have bigger plans for them. We actually want to get out there and use them as a tool to help us in our mission to reduce crime and increase the quality of life in our community. A program such as this, would hamper the goals that we're trying to accomplish. Please understand where we're coming from as the staff team that put these recommendations to you. In the end, we're asking council to give us recommendations and give us direction. We think there's been a lot of great discussion today. Much of it was covered by us. We knew that council would have these points to discuss, and so we're grateful to see that everybody's kind of thinking through the ramifications of these decisions.
To follow up on your idea, Your Honor, with our planning cases, we automatically generate postcards that are mailed to the adjacent property owners. So it might be something that we could look into with the program, that if there is a permit applied that would trigger notification of the property owners, at least they would know to come down here on a certain date, because we wouldn't want to make it into perpetuity, but while that application is in process, be able to come before council and voice a concern that way.
I'd rather see something like that happen, because then we're not so we're putting postage out in the cost of a postcard. I'd rather spend that than, people out of law enforcement to go knocking on doors. The three things that I've heard here tonight, though, and I think in helping make a decision on this on direction, is that there's other options out there, and I don't necessarily like the idea of parking cars in front yards, but there are other options out there. I like the idea of a survey, and I know in our past council, we survey things to death, and some people didn't like that. But I think that by opening it up and putting a survey out to the public to ask them their thoughts on this is important, because that's going to give us information back as to whether people feel that this is an important enough issue for us to move forward on. And then I would like to see some information from other communities. If other communities flat out, similar to our community itself, if they flat out say, nope, we don't allow it, then we'll have reasons behind it. We'll know why they don't do it. If they do allow it, then what are those reasons? But I'd rather see a little bit more on that personally before I move forward to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So, Councilman Cathy.
Well, I was going to bring up the idea of the postcards, but you went ahead and brought that up. Appreciate that, Liz, and I think that's an excellent plan. My question is, does it immediately then need to come to council, or is this something that should wind up going to P&Z for approval? And maybe that be the end of it. I hate to see I want to park my car on the parkway having to come all the way to city council. I think that's a bit of overreach. I don't know whether you want to call it overreach or not, but by the same token, too, I do like Councilman Nell's idea that if we're going to allow it, it needs to be done in a responsible way. We don't need the mud holes and the things along those lines that we currently have. That does need to be cleaned up, and they do need to be done appropriately. But I can sympathize with the people that have some of the larger vehicles having their mirrors knocked off and for fear of having their vehicles damaged. You go out and buy a $70,000 pickup truck, I don't know whether you really want to park it on 12th or 13th Street. So that's the concern you have to think about as well. So I think a good compromise of the proposals that are here is an excellent path forward.
Chief?
Mayor, thank you. I just wanted to point out one thing. When we discuss the permitting process, the due process elements of permitting in the city of Casper is that if you receive an adverse decision on your permit request, there's an appeal. And I just don't, I want, as council is deliberating the impact of this stuff, that we recognize that as the mayor gave the example of a single neighbor said, no, I don't want this, and a permit would be possibly be rejected over that. You know, what is the appeal process? And we're not trying to create a cumbersome wheel of government that needs oiled and greased constantly to keep functioning on behalf of our citizens. So you're not wrong. We think the Planning and Zoning Committee, they meet for limited amounts of time. They've got a heavy agenda, and they have critical decisions, and I personally wouldn't want to see them bogged down with 400 of these, for example.
Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If indeed council is looking for a position that would be more of a compromise position between, you know, the continuum of keeping the ordinance as it is, which is kind of a no thanks, no how, or the other end of the continuum being everything's open and people can park whatever they want there, I would suggest some guidelines that council could consider. The solid surface idea, I think, is a really good idea. And I think that those opportunities should only be made available with certain streets in the community. Maybe that's a gauge that is determined by the width of that street or by the amount of traffic or whatever, but there's a way that we can clarify which streets would make sense to have these kinds of opportunities made available if parkways exist there, of course. I do think that there ought to be a limit in the form of the type of equipment that's allowed in there. Like, for example, on your picture here, you see trailers, you see RVs and so on. Maybe the ordinance would clarify exactly what that should be. Is it I don't know, but I think it ought to be clear as to what could be allowed or should be allowed. I do think we need to make clear that the removal of trees is prohibited in order to make more space available in those parkways. I do think that in any effort on a property owner to utilize these parkways that results in the blocking of a sidewalk or the damaging of curbing or whatever ought to be disallowed as well. And so from my standpoint, and as your manager, I'd recommend that a compromise position somewhere in the middle of the continuum with some guidelines attached can make a lot of sense. And I think that would fit a lot of need, particularly in some of these areas of town that just have real skinny, real narrow streets.
Okay. Councilwoman Ingebretson.
So I agree with the trees, but we also have a whole lot of zombie trees still existing. So I think that it would be an improvement if they were to cut down the dead ones. I think that would be an improvement. But as for the enforcement and somebody gets a permit, would that be something that we could add to the online, as in reporting a pothole, reporting your garbage can, just add that on, and somebody say, hey, I've got somebody that's parking the RV, I can't see around it, and then we can go out and investigate it. That way, it just simplifies the matter a little bit.
Councilman Nell.
Thanks, sir. Carter, I'm with you. I like the idea, and I think there need to be parameters. You know, a couple things you just maybe overlooked was, you know, we got to be certain distance back from corners. You know, line of sight's got to be certainly one of the top things. We can't have people parking right on the corner. It's gonna, we all know what that's gonna do. But and I do know most cities don't allow parking on the parkway, at least cities I've lived in. But they don't have our unique situation either. They don't have some of these streets that we're putting 8 million miles a year on. that were built, like Mr. Cathy said, in 1960. They're not, him and I couldn't go side by side on our pickups anywhere, if anybody's parked. So, you know, there's a need, and I think we're up here to represent our people, our constituents, and I've had many reach out to me on those streets saying, will you help us? And I said, I'll do what I can. And so that's what we're doing here today, and I appreciate everybody's ability to be able to talk about it, because there's a lot of different dynamics. We're not gonna make everybody happy. You're gonna have somebody on 12th Street who has the most beautiful manicured front part, and now the neighbor's parking his car right there, and they're gonna be up in arms. I can already see it. But I can tell you, driving up and down those streets, which I've done an extensive amount of my own personal research, the good's way gonna outweigh the bad as far as alleviating places to park. Some of those people that buy them houses don't even have a driveway or any kind of parking. They have no choice but to park on the street. That's all they have. So anyway, with that, I'm with you. I like the idea of maybe moving in that direction if we could, and so that we can appease maybe more than just one group of people. Thanks.
Carter, is it something that we could get written up from the committee then, along the lines of what you were saying, and then bring it back in front of council and then maybe take it from there? Everybody, as long as everybody on council is good with that.
Mr. Mayor, we absolutely could. And in fact, if you'd like it for the next work session, we could make that happen.
Okay, everybody okay with that? Okay. Let's do that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Your Honor, one last question. We didn't talk about fees. I mean, do we want to incorporate something like that into an application?
Councilman now.
I think a fee is a good idea. I do think we could possibly issue some type of a credit for those that are willing to put the money into enhancing that area to park, because I could tell you from my own experience doing mine, cost me about $1,200, and I poured my own, I did it myself. So for them to contract that out, they're probably looking at a $2,500 bill that the city now owns. They're aesthetically improving our property, so maybe definitely a permit fee, but maybe some type of a credit if they choose to enhance that property on their own. Just a thought.
I had all the other ideas as Carter did, but that was one I wanted to follow up on.
Everybody okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to council goals and objectives. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the previous conversation. I think we got a lot of good direction there. Council goals. We set aside 90 minutes to consider the the variety of directions that council could go here, and we tried to provide some level of, thank you, Claire, some level of maybe a framework, if you will, as it relates to ideas that we've been able to gather. And as you read the memo, we gathered some ideas from a few resources here. First of all, I had the opportunity to visit with many of you sort of on a one-on-one basis, and I tried to take notes of many of your ideas and so forth, and bring those ideas that at least resulted in somewhat of a common theme among a number of you forward, as it seemed like that seemed to be of a common interest to many of you. There were a couple that we recommended as well in terms of ideas that we thought had some traction still in the community, and with regard to some things that we were hoping to accomplish. And without a doubt, we also heard from the collective group in work sessions and pre-meetings and so forth that there was some interest as well on a couple matters here and there also. You'll also notice that we indeed have tried to consult the comprehensive plan as well as some other real key bodies of work that have taken place in recent years, not the least of which is also the Endow report that was, albeit done on a statewide basis, provided a lot of good direction as well over the last couple years. Without a doubt, these are just ideas, and we do need council to help us flesh out these concepts, so that at the end of the day, staff has a good feel of what direction you'd like to go and what it is that you'd like us to work on. Because the reality is, some of this stuff is going to have budgetary implications. And with respect to understanding with some clarity what it is you'd like to see happen, that gives us some lead time to work on putting the budget together as sort of a resulting action that we would need to follow with. So while certainly we view this as pretty strategic and an opportunity to be in lockstep with what you'd like to see happen, this also gives us a lot of answers to the quiz as it relates to designing the budget and putting together that real critical document that helps us allocate the resources in a way that you see as appropriate. One of the other things that we included in this document that you have is sort of a large, grand view as it relates to some of the major capital projects that we have in front of us over the next 5 to 10 years, if you will. And none, I'm not sure that any of these will be a real surprise to you because we've talked about some of this to some degree. But we are suggesting that some of these be kept in kind of your 30,000-foot view of the matters that we need to discuss and work toward over time. As you do that, we can start talking about financial solutions that we think, could help in at least our build-up to making some progress on some of these major conversations that we'll be having from here on out. The last thing that I would draw your attention to is the paradigm that we would recommend conversations like this, conversations like legislative discussions and budgetary discussions would be had within. And that would be captured in the conclusion portion of your council goals memo and exhibit, wherein we talk about some of the, again, 30,000 sort of paradigm, lens adjusting kinds of things that we would ask for your participation in as well. As you can see in those bullets, a lot of it is revenue and expense reconciliation against the new norm that potentially we're going to be working in here. Without a doubt, legislative decisions can happen almost any legislative season that would impact our ability to function appropriately, operationally. As a result, we've talked about direct distribution. We've talked about changes in the severance and mineral formulas and mixes that we share with the state. Right now we're working on fire pension A, as I've mentioned to you before, and that has a huge implication possibility for us from a revenue standpoint. But in the same token, as we talk about those expenses that we need to support, I think it needs to go along with our community as it relates to what they'd like to see. As I've mentioned in a lot of community groups lately, since the beginning of the year anyway, 9 times out of 10, when folks want to talk to me, about reconciling revenues and expenses and trying to adjust ourselves to living within our means, folks want to talk about the recreational kinds of expenses and those commitments and whatnot. And that's easy to understand because there are subsidies that those services require, which draw from our general funds and many would argue take away from our hard infrastructure and our hard services that we need to provide. And finding that balance between what's appropriate is a really, really tough discussion, particularly as it relates to cutting services, because that generally means having those service users show up and share their opinions rather vociferously, in the context of that type of a recommendation. So these kinds of conversations are important for us. We need your direction because we want to be your partner in having things happen that you want to see happen. And while we have certainly listed a few ideas here that we think has some commonality, we recognize that council may also add some things to that list or take away from that list or whatever. So tonight's a night to at least get this conversation started. I can see us needing to come back at least one more time so that we can help flesh out some of this and bring back to you a finished product that ultimately would need the support of a resolution to adopt, if you will. But I can also foresee wanting to come back in maybe one or two discussions to flesh this out appropriately if council so chooses. Okay?
Okay.
So, Mr. Mayor, as it relates to the list, as I mentioned here, I'm really focusing on that bulletized item. And it looks like page 93 in your packet, based on what I'm seeing here in front of me, hard copy. You'll see a kind of a brief list, basic infrastructure support, pro-development initiatives. The police station has been mentioned a lot with this group, but I've also heard, that against the context of larger capital project planning. I've heard the discussion of strategic planning brought up a number of times as well. And we sent out an email tonight with regard to kind of a compendium of plans that the city has worked on over the years that if indeed we do have this discussion, I would invite that discussion being had with respect to that document in mind. And that's new to you tonight. I recognize that because we've been working on that here in the last couple weeks. I've heard a lot of discussion about engaging the citizenry in a more useful way. Certainly using social media more strategically and so forth has been a common theme with many of you also. Not only from the standpoint of gaining input, but as it relates to educating our citizenry as well with respect to the nuances that you all have to grapple with every decision that you make. Tonight's discussion is a great example of that dynamic that you have to juggle. But I've also heard that managing our message is something that we could do better at. And I don't disagree. Certainly, I think some guidance along those lines is probably very appropriate. Marketing our assets more effectively is also something I've heard from a number of you. And so, this particular bullet, this particular area of interest has a lot of directions it can go. And much of this can, as you have probably picked up on. And then, of course, the idea of looking at subsidies really, really closely pertaining to recreational assets and services and whatnot. You'll get the opportunity to talk about that here actually coming up real soon, in that we do have some recommendations along those lines that we're working on and that we're bringing forward not only to yourselves but to the Leisure Services Board and against the backdrop of what the business plans propose at this point in time. So those are some ideas to start with. Mr. Mayor, I think there's just a ton of different directions that we can go, but if indeed council wants to, give some feedback on at least this list as a point of departure for other ideas that council may want to introduce for the group to consider, we are wide open with regard to whatever direction you'd like to see this take place.
Good. So do we want to start off with the list itself then, and
Sure, if that's okay.
where everybody wants to go with? Councilman Nell.
Thank you. So I've brought this up before, and I've checked through our packets. I don't see it anywhere yet. But one of the objectives was citizen engagement. And I think one of the biggest steps we can take towards doing that, and I've mentioned this before, is our city council meetings are at the same exact time, on the same exact day as the county commissioner meetings. And so it's been brought to my attention several times that if we were to flip our work session and our city council meetings, just flop them. So in other words, tonight would be a city council meeting. It gives our constituents a much better opportunity to find out what's going on in the city, and then the next week find out what's going on in the county. Because as it is right now, they can't attend both meetings. And so I would really like to push us to making that change if we can, so that we are opposite of the county commission, and it gives our constituents we're here every Tuesday anyway. So it just gives our people an opportunity to know a heck of a lot more about what's going on. So that's one. And then the other one, I would just urge you on the police station. I know it's listed on here as a $40 million expenditure. I think we need to just hold off and wait until our committee is done doing their work, because I think we're going to find ways to do that and not literally not cost us any more money. In my mind, that's the way I'm seeing it. So I think we just need to give that committee a chance to work. But I can't stress enough on this trying to flip our work session and I don't know budgetary wise, state wise, if that's a possibility. Have you checked into that yet? Or, because I know I've mentioned it to you, so.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, just to respond to that briefly, we do have that item scheduled on the pre-meeting for March 2nd. The idea being that the business meetings would revolve around each other. We will still have a conflict as it relates to work sessions that are scheduled and pre-meetings that are scheduled and those kinds of things. But as it relates to business meetings, kind of fitting in on correlating dates, I was hoping we could cover that in some detail on the 2nd in the pre-meeting, if that's okay. But I wouldn't disagree. That's very worthy to talk about. Absolutely.
And I didn't mean to jump ahead in the schedule. I didn't see it on the pre-meeting, but it went with citizen engagement. That's why I wanted to throw it out there.
No problem.
I appreciate it. I'll wait till the 2nd.
Councilmember Pollock.
I think a lot of what's on this list certainly reflects the conversations that you and I have had and that I've had with other council members. So I think it's a really good starting point. When I'm looking at strategic planning as a point specifically, for me, I think having some focus there could help us do a few things where we have a comprehensive plan, but we're also pulling in information from many other reports. So we just got this report list. And to me, having all these separate reports, doesn't lend itself to the type of comprehensive look that I think we need. I think the comprehensive plan is pretty close. I'm really pleased that we're adding in some information from the Endow reports. I think there's some really good information in there that we can use to the advantage of our citizenry. What I'd like to see in the strategic planning side of things is really kind of going through some of these other reports. These are heavy investments in a lot of these reports with consultants and things like that. And I think that a fair criticism of these reports sometimes is that they just get put somewhere and they don't get fully incorporated into how we operate. And I think it is really frustrating. I've been involved in producing a number of these reports or participating in a number of these reports. And, I think if we're going to go to the trouble of doing the report, we need to really use it to its full capacity. So I think doing some strategic planning to bring some of this information together would be really helpful. And I also think we need a plan, because I do think the comprehensive plan is a very good start. I think we need a plan for how to keep that updated on our own, rather than having to, in 3 or 4 years, bring in another consultant. I think I'd like to avoid, and then they come in and tell us nearly the same thing, whereas if we would have been taking a really critical look every year, how are we doing, where are we going, what do we need to add based on vision and how things have changed in our community, then maybe we would look at it in 5 or 6 or 10 years and it wouldn't be out of date. It would still be relevant and a useful tool for us today. I think if we maintain some of these reports for our own use, maybe we can avoid some, reinventing the wheel in another 10 years when this report is now out of date.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
And I'm just keep looking over these considerations and so forth. One of the things I think that we probably need to talk about, and I've mentioned it to a few council members myself, and I think the next few years are going to be really a test as we see the state struggle financially as far as minerals. And so I don't know if there's a conversation that we need to probably start having. One, obviously, city obviously is trying to look at economic development and how we partner with things like with Advance and how we try to do those types of things with EDJP and what is our vision to do that. I think it's going to be a really, really critical point here, probably in the next 5 to 10 years for the state of Wyoming, because right now our diversification is not what it could be or should be probably. And no one wants to talk about taxes. Nobody wants to talk about those things. We're afraid of that. But I think the question is that how do we move forward with economic development? And if we're not getting much guidance from the state legislature, then we need to start looking at ourselves and say, how do we do that? And maybe that's a conversation we need to have, Carter.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I would just like to concur with some of the things that Councilwoman Pollock was saying as far as the, well, first off, thank you for putting together the list. I do think it's a good list, and I think it's, at least the conversations I've had with you, I felt like it was comprehensive. But to second her point, I would like to see us coming at this from a more strategic perspective. You know, I went through the Generation Casper plan myself. It's 180 pages. And so took extensive notes on that. You know, thank you so much for sending the email of all the plans that our city has done, because I was a little overwhelmed myself going through Generation Casper. I took note of all the plans that are referenced. It's, you know, between 15 and 18, somewhere around 1,000 pages of supplemental material for that. So personally, I'd like to get through as much of it as possible, but the folks, the departments that are all familiar with these, you know, the walkability study, I'm sure there's a, you know, group of city folk that are very familiar with that, even if I, council, and others aren't. So I would love to come at this from a more strategic perspective and make sure we're incorporating all these plans, because as Councilwoman Pollock has said, lots of time, effort, money has been spent putting these plans together. So I guess I would like to second that. And I apologize. Again, it's so much. I have 3 different documents that I've kept notes on for goal planning, for Generation Casper, and for the meeting this evening. So, but I'd just like to voice my support. I would love to come at it from a more strategic perspective and make sure we're incorporating the recommendations used in many of these plans, because again, they have a lot of data and you know, evidence to support them. So, thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I'd like to hit on the citizen engagement itself. I think that we've seen quite a few things in the last year that have taken place that I would have liked us to have been in front of prior to them happening, or being able to just put the information out as quickly as we can. I think there's a huge need for that, so I think that, you know, just expanding on our app that we have, that we can get out there and get needed information out in a timely manner, or as things are happening, just again get in front of it and let the public know what our plans are prior to doing it, so that if there is any feedback, positive or negative, we'd have that before we move forward. So I'm glad to see that's on the list. Councilman Cathy.
The one thing that I think is very interesting, and I think maybe Councilman Johnson and Councilman Pacheco might remember it, but I believe Councilwoman Pollock's comments about continually updating within House our plans for the future is something that's been brought up in previous councils and has never been followed through with. So I think that is something that we probably ought to try to follow through with, because as was stated, that will definitely keep they become living documents rather than, as was stated, something stuck on a shelf. And we quit hiring all of these consultants all of the time. You know, it's a very good plan. So I wanted to stress that that's been suggested before. It's brought up again now. So maybe we ought to try to get on board with that idea. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is this the appropriate time I know we typically do this at the ad, you know, some things, but since we're in the middle of it, we talked about the committee for the police department. Is this an appropriate time to talk about, you know, maybe potential committees we'd like to see formed to address some issues, or should we save that maybe till the end?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. So there are a couple that I'd be personally interested in seeing and or serving on. So we did, a couple of us had a resident from the community share with us a news article today about, it's from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle, Cheyenne City Council They just created a technology advisory council and an innovation and entrepreneur advisory council. For a few different reasons. They had, I think, a large venture capital firm relocate to the area. And so, you know, they're just trying to be proactive, making sure that their city, as they're moving forward, developing, are being very mindful of these two areas. And I just think that's really cool. Maybe something worth considering on our end. Since we have such a strong entrepreneurial energy here, and we are seeing some kind of exciting new businesses form here, maybe that's something we might consider. They have some really cool features, such as the inclusion of, you know, this Entrepreneur Advisory Council includes 5 18 to 25-year-old mentees that are able to help keep the committee informed on developing technology and stuff like that. And so they have, you know, that's something they just did today. So I imagine there'll be more information about that in the future, and that's something that I think would be cool for us to explore. The other one is something I know it's been city, you know, council-wide emails that we've received just since I've been on council, and I know this is focused of discussion last year, but trap, spay, and neuter, you know, animal ordinance and stuff like that. I don't know if there was a discussion last year about forming a committee when y'all were talking about that, but I personally think it's worth the development of a committee for a couple reasons. One is just, you know, the current state of our trapping and spaying and neutering and euthanization, I imagine is not the ideal place where it's supposed to be. I was passed along a gal that runs a nonprofit in the state. She had, perhaps we have access to it, but this is how I got the information. She had an annual report from Metro, and so, you know, was going through that information, the fact that we do euthanize a couple hundred feral cats every year. The majority of the cats that end up at Metro, 4-to-1 ratio, they're unaltered, and about a third of those that come in unaltered end up spayed or neutered, but the rest go out to the community and aren't. And so there's Evansville, I know, just began a TNR program this year to address a couple large cat colonies in their town. There have been several successful examples of spay and neuter programs, Second Chance Sheridan Cat Rescue and the Dog and Cat Shelter in Sheridan. They had 2,300 cats in their city limits, 3,800 in their community. And after they implemented this program, they saw the number of stray kittens brought to the shelter decline by 60% and those euthanized cut by 85%. There's another program in Rock Springs. Started in 2014, they joined the Wyoming Shelter Project, so their euthanasia for cats went down from 70 to 16%, dogs from 30 to 2%, and they reduced their animal intake by 40%. So there's lots of people in the community. I have some names, and there's also lots of agencies, organizations in our state. These folks are very passionate about these issues. There's funding sources for these issues, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support revisiting the way that we go about this. And so I would really love to form a committee to take advantage of the energy in the community. These folks, again, they're already expending a lot of their time and energy. So if we could focus that and take advantage of their willingness to help and explore some of these new funding resources, I'd absolutely be willing to serve on that committee if we could move forward on that front. So that's all I have for the moment. Thanks for your patience.
Mr. City Manager, is that something, the last one, spay and neuter, is that something that we can just add back onto a work session agenda as far as forming a committee, or is that something that, is that the best way of handling that?
Certainly, I think, Mr. Mayor, if indeed there are some volunteers in the community who would rally around the idea of you know, kind of organizing and working on some matters of common interest with respect to pet management in our community. You know, I think that's something that if council wants to just tell us to you know, work on and move forward with, we certainly can. If its aim is to work on a TNR, that's great. If the aim is to you know, focus on ways in which we can, you know, reduce the amount of feral cats that we euthanize every year, that's a mission. What I would prefer is that if indeed there are these missions and focuses that a group like that would like to take on, it'd be helpful to really sit down with that group and kind of narrow those things down and see if there isn't something substantive and tangible that we can say, okay, here's our goal, here's what we can move forward to, and we can just start working with those folks versus taking up the entire council's time to have those conversations and try to do that at the council, the entire council level versus a smaller volunteer level.
So I guess where I was headed with that is, are you wanting that to be a goal and an objective, or are we wanting to bring feral cats and the animal issue up again as a work session item and then form a committee if they want to do that? So I guess that's...
Yeah, my recommendation would be if council wants us to just start working with these volunteers, we can do that. I don't know that we need to bring ordinance changes forward at this point in time or other work session items at this point in time. Maybe when the group organizes a little bit and has some ideas put together.
Okay. Councilmember Pollack.
Seems to me that maybe the goal there would be to, engage citizenry through committee work, because there's a couple different committees mentioned. We've already identified maybe one, just because that issue has already arisen, but I do think that's a really powerful way to harness the expertise and the passion and the enthusiasm in our community. I've been really, I feel like personally and as a council, we've benefited from the committees that we are already working with. They're providing us with really helpful information. And so I think, continuing to think about what are some topics that maybe we can look to the community and find folks. It's a lot of folks who are very passionate, who are willing to volunteer and provide us that expertise on an ongoing basis. So I think maybe that's the goal. Maybe we keep that on our radar so that we are looking for those opportunities where it's appropriate. And then maybe, separate under that, Kyle mentioned too, I agree with, especially the first one. I'm not as expert as Mr. Gamroth is on the TNR program, but in terms of what our next gen workforce looks like, how do we develop our technology economy, things like that. I mean, to me, there's lots of potential, and so maybe that's the goal, and then the sub goals and the sub outcomes underneath that. TNR is maybe one of them that we're ready to move on right away.
Councilman Cathy.
Well, for those that were not here for the arduous process of getting the current ordinance in place, the TNR people came here and said they were going to form a TNR committee and set up and form a TNR program. I think it's on their shoulders to bring that up and to do that and to come to us with the program rather than us reinstituting and trying to develop it ourselves. They have said 10 years ago they were going to do this. It fell through. They told us within the last 12 months they were going to get that program set up. We still have seen nothing. They keep constantly coming to us, expecting us to do it. It's on their shoulders to do it. And a comment that I even made at the time is, releasing those cats back into the population does not help the neighbors whose flower beds they are destroying and defecating in, and the kids' sandboxes that are being defecated in. And I will always stand up for those people versus the cats. My 2 cents worth.
Councilman Gamroth.
Thank you, Councilman Cathy, for your comments. I lived in the Brigham Young area by the fairgrounds, and stray cats everywhere, and my Yorkies love to eat all the things they left behind. So I have personal experience with stray cats. Personally not a fan. I think cat owners in the community should be a lot more responsible, not let their cats out. I think it's an irresponsible thing to do, if you're asking me. But lots of evidence to support. I'm coming at this not only to harness the citizens' energy and enthusiasm on this, but also I think the evidence is strong and compelling that it's a fiscally conservative approach. We have, I connected with a gal from the Summerlee Foundation. I forget where that's based out of, but it's not Wyoming. She had a 3-year proposal. It would fund for 3 years the program, and then the idea is that the cost savings after that would be enough to justify continuing to the program. So she sent that, I don't remember if that was just to me or all of us on council, but it was a proposal they pitched to city council some 10, 15 years ago, And she said that the response that they got from the chief of police at the time, not our great Chief McFeeters, but the chief of police at the time, was that their officers use feral cats for target practice. And so that was the response they got from our city at the time. I think that's shameful. It's too bad if that's the case. But again, I do think you mentioned the, it would not be a overnight fix, that's for sure. The program to avoid the vacuum effect and some of these other things, you tag them, you spay and neuter them, and you leave them in the area. And so there would be, a period of time where you'd have to wait for that population to drop. But we have a lot of very important things to address. You did a great job outlining these big capital projects and stuff. So I don't think this is the most important issue. But again, it's one of those things I would be more than happy to serve on a committee if that's all it is to help channel this energy. I'd volunteer for that. I guess that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thank you. I kind of like to correct us back to goals and objectives. I think this is a conversation we can have, but I think it's super critical that we have this conversation about our goals and objectives. This is something that I think we dearly, dearly need for the next year. And so I just want to kind of correct us back into that lane of having that conversation of what that is and what the next step is for us in the next couple of years for this council. So that's all I kind of want to make sure that we're making sure that we're doing that right now. Thank you.
That's kind of where I was going a little bit ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mayor.
And that's okay. And Mr. Mayor, I think the direction I'm hearing is using committee work as a means to engage the community is maybe something you'd add to the list of ideas as to how to engage the citizens. TNR or pet management happens to be one of those items. And I hear that, and I think we can probably use that as a tool. You bet.
Councilman Gamera.
Go ahead for Councilwoman.
Councilwoman Lutz.
So, and Ray kind of already done this, but I think that from what I can tell you that out there, just in the general business/finance community, a lot of strategic planning for a lot of entities at this point have boiled down to basically survival. Because obviously, when you look at like long-term economic projections and even short-term economic projections, definitely based on what role that you think will happen in the next 12 to 18 months. I really do think that it's not going to be quote unquote fun, because it's not going to be like the fun, pretty, attractive, eye-catching type projects that, people always want to talk about or bring up or think about. What I really think a lot of our discussion is going to have to be based on is, I think the staff did an amazing job on the document kind of pointing out, hey guys, here's some big problems that we have in the next handful of years. Whether it's facilities not, being able to hold at that capacity, or whether it's things like, treatment centers that aren't going to be able to continue to basically treat the things we want them to for much longer without, major capital influx. And so, and obviously, revenue is probably the biggest part of this conversation that is so out of our control at this point, I don't even know how to talk about it. And so, unfortunately, I think when we talk about goals and objectives, we really have to start thinking basic, as far as money in, money out. So I know that's sad and hard, but it's probably the truth.
Councilman Gamera.
I would concur with Councilwoman Lutz. So I guess my question is, we have the 90 minutes allotted. I used up 30, 40 of it talking about TNR, but so I guess, I'd like to know how do we dig into this? I mean, I read through all the goal planning documents and have a lot of questions and things I'd like to follow up on and stuff, but I guess I don't know how do we go about, addressing some of those questions, getting the information and moving forward is my question. Thank you.
Councilman Johnson.
Well, typically what we've done in the past is we come up with 3 major goals for the city, right? I think one year we did downtown infrastructure and recreation, and then underneath each one of those were sub-goals and different ways that we can achieve the overall overarching goal with the help of the city staff. So I think if we focus our energy on 3 or 4, however many goals, overarching goals, and then the city staff can help us with the sub-goals and how we get to those points.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you. Mr. City Manager, I'm thinking strategic planning during a fiscal downfall and not even a good projection available. I think we're going to have some direction from you, actually, before we can give you some. I think there's going to have to be, these are going to have to be prioritized, in my opinion. You've got a list of, 5, 6, 7 things here, and to me, I think we need to have a rating on what's our priority. I mean, these are all obviously priority, but there's got to be something that's more important than the other, whether it's our water treatment plant or whether it's, our wastewater. So I guess for me, in order to come up with a true strategic plan, I would have to need to understand from you, how are you prioritizing these things? Where do they sit in immediate needs and maybe not so immediate? Because I noticed some of these we've put off for years. And obviously that's probably due to a lack of funding, I'm guessing. But at some point, something's got to give. And we can't just throw money at all of it because we don't have it. So what I would ask from you, for me personally, is to prioritize some of this so we can kind of get a better idea of what you're thinking and what comes first. I mean,
Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, I appreciate that. That's good direction. That's a good piece of input, and we can certainly do that. I guess my question would be from the standpoint: Are you saying that from the standpoint of a kind of a capital planning position, or are you talking about from this list of 7 or so bullets, or what?
kind of from your list. So my idea of a strategic plan is making decisions as a collective group to decide and prioritize what we need to get done, so that we can strategically attack it and handle it and take care of it. That's my idea of a strategic plan. Otherwise, goal setting's great, but when you throw out 10 or 12 goals and, the end of the year comes around and you might have gotten to 2 or 3 of them. So, and in my opinion, that's kind of where we're going to be at fiscally, especially. We're not going to be able to get this whole list done. You know it and I know it. Yeah. So my idea is if we're really going to have a strategic plan and we're going to attack this thing, we need to know where our priorities are, or where your priorities are, I guess, so that we can help you facilitate getting done what we need to get done. Does that make sense? Absolutely,
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, and we can certainly do that. There's a few of the items that you have on your list here that I would suggest probably do rise to the top, if you will. And if you're open to that kind of feedback, I'd be happy to give it. And if I need to do more homework on that, I'm happy to do that too, because I want to put together what it is that you feel like is representative of your collective will here. Councilman Johnson makes a good point as well as it relates to sort of our top 3 focuses, if you will. And from an essentialist standpoint, that's real critical because we can't accomplish everything in the face of declining revenues and resources to throw at everything. Although there are some things that don't necessarily require a ton of resources to get accomplished, if you will, like the committee work suggestion that you all are kind of rallying around, if you will. One of the things that I'm really concerned about is moving forward with respect to some of these larger capital needs in a real deliberate and calculated way, so that in the period of time where those useful life concerns come to bear, we have answers and solutions, and we can pull the trigger on the right mechanisms to make some of those resources come to the table at the right times. So I would certainly say that would be one of the higher priorities that I would identify. With respect to, say, let's talk about streets for just a second here. I've certainly heard a lot of you say that streets are a big concern, particularly in light of the study that we shared with you just a couple weeks ago that said if we're really going to be serious about improving streets, we probably need to dedicate about $7 million worth of investment versus the $3 million that we're trying to scrape together these days. And that is appropriate feedback. Some of that planning might have to be in the face of looking at 1% as a more deliberative effort to ratchet up that investment. which isn't going to come around for another couple years because we've kind of already drawn our contract with the community with regard to the 1% funds that we've already committed to. So those are some ideas, at least in ways in which I would tackle this particular aspect of it, but I do think that does need some higher priority attention. One of the other things that I would suggest that I'm hearing from business owners at this point in time is with regard to our technological infrastructure that's in need of some support from a redundancy standpoint. We have some of that we deal with directly as it relates to connectivity between our buildings and so forth. But we also have the opportunity to request some help from the private sector that might improve those kinds of things. If I'm hearing that from the business community, I would probably be willing to advocate that to you as being a higher priority as well, because the business community is saying, hey, this is a direction we're going in because we're trying to migrate to, a cloud-based business environment. And we can't do that if indeed our access to that infrastructure isn't viewed like turning on a spigot for running water. I heard that metaphor just the other day. And that really brought to my attention the importance that the business community looks at this as. And so that'd be probably another higher priority thing that I would want you to focus on, or at least have support for. The other thing, I guess, if I were to pick a top three, that citizen engagement seems to be a real high priority thing that we need to talk more about. Invariably, we're going to talk about subsidies regardless, because we are in a situation where revenues are declining, our revenue portfolio is shrinking, and at least possibly shrinking. That's going to be part and parcel to strategic budgetary planning. And so I don't think we have a choice but to prioritize those kinds of discussions as well. So if that is, a smidgen of what I would offer at this point in time, that would be my suggestion for the top 3 or 4 things that I would recommend we really hone in on. Great question. Thank you.
Councilman Cassidy.
Well, a comment that I would like to make along those lines is in some of the, quote, strategic planning or goal setting sessions that have been held by private facilitators, they have recommended, as has been mentioned as well, to stick with goals in the 3 to 5 range, because as Councilman Nell stated, if you wind up with 12, you're not going to make it there. The other thing that I kind of look at, and I think it's been alluded to in a couple of places here, is that a strategic plan is something that should come together and transcend councils, because otherwise all you're doing is 2-year plans, and these projects that we're looking at here are actually 3-year, 5-year plans, and we need to be looking at those, and our individual council goals should be the 3 to 5 to focus on how to make it to that 5 to 10 year strategic plan is kind of the way I look at it. And so, one of those strategic plans may ultimately be, how do we get to $7 million a year for streets? How do we get to the $21 million that we will need for the Sam Hobbs plant? Because those aren't 2-year projects. But what can we do this year to start achieving to get that money is kind of the way I look at this type of a project. Because if we just look at, well, what are we going to do the next 2 years, that again will wind up kicking those projects down the road. And we've done enough can kicking. We aren't 5 years old playing kick the can. Thank you.
Councilwoman Ingbertson.
So I agree with the strat plan that we just need to have an overall basic plan to kind of go off of and then continue to roll on that. I guess part of my concern is I believe, like, for instance, the police station. it's been pushed off, pushed off, when we probably could have done something better 10 years ago. And I think that the police station's been a problem for a great many years. But now it's now getting continually pushed off to where now it's becoming an emergency. So if we keep pushing these big projects off, then it's just going to snowball, and then everything's going to be an emergency. So if we were to plan now and try to put things in place now, had we had started the police station and planning 4 years ago, we would be sitting in a lot better position than we are right now. And so, I mean, this problem isn't going to go away. So we do need the strat plan, but we also kind of need to know what we've been pushing off and what's actually closer to an emergency situation that we're dealing with now, and what's going to be an emergency, say, in 5-10 years, kind of a scenario.
Well, I guess to add to what you're saying too, is that you also need to keep in mind, and I think it was Mr. Cortez that I actually had this conversation with prior, was a lot of our facilities were built back in the 80s, and so now we're at that point that they're all aging, and you're going to have a lot of issues that are going to start coming up, and they're going to have to be addressed, but they're all going to come at one time. So, yeah. Councilmember Pollock.
Maybe I'll try to synthesize what I'm hearing into something that is more like a goal. So maybe we can put something up on the wall and see if it sticks. But one would be this year, develop a long-range capital plan that takes us through all of these projects. What is the order that they need to happen in, ideally, based on the critical nature of them? And how are we going to figure out how to pay for it out over how many years? So, I mean, there's $178 million worth of projects just in this small list. So just put together the plan so that we can start to move forward on whatever we deem, is the first step to do that. So that'd be one goal that I think we could accomplish this year, and start to, implement into our work. The second goal that I'm hearing is come up with a citizen engagement strategy that is multidisciplinary and multi-department. So that would be a second goal that I think we could create that plan this year and begin to execute it. So there's two.
Mr. Manager, I guess I'd have a question for you then, as far as if we look for a long-range goal on how to deal with what we have here. I'd also like to take a look at so we're looking at what we need to handle within the community and take care of within the community. What does this community not have that would attract? So, we're obviously looking at an oil and gas. This is going to become a problem, and it's going to become a problem for us over the next few years. So what does this community not have that we could put in place that would attract or diversify our economy by bringing other businesses here? What do we lack as a community that would put, have businesses look at Casper and say, this is a place I want to do business. This is where I want to go, and attract those businesses here to diversify the economy, bring more jobs here that obviously we may not be able to rely upon in the roller coaster ride we call oil and gas. Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess on that point, not necessarily about attracting businesses. I guess these are just some of the notes I just wanted to make, because if we move forward with, I think Councilwoman Pollock set us on a good note to have some meaningful goals by the end of this meeting, and have an idea where we're going to go over the next year. But since you mentioned some of the things that could bring people to Casper that they're not currently here, I guess some of the things, as I was going through the goal planning Generations Casper, some of the things I'd like follow up on is, there was talk in the Generation Casper plan about the urban growth boundary and the importance of keeping growth in a more dense central area, for the importance of critical services, utilities, but also just growth. It seems to be that's how growth occurs. And so it sounds like over the past few years there was some issues with potentially too much retail development over on the east side of town. And so I'd love from a planning and zoning commission, how do we, those issues that we've identified the past several years, moving forward the next couple of years, how do we remedy those and make sure that that doesn't continue to be a problem. The transportation plan was talking about several issues that we have, lack of an east-west arterial roadway. So as we, look at growing or something, do we need to potentially look at the way our roads are structured or have smarter traffic lights or roundabouts, or is that something that we just have to, we developed that way 50 years ago and we just have to suffer with it through the rest of our existence? Or is that lack of an east-west arterial roadway, is that going to be a crippling thing for us that, is going to cap our potential until we address it? Zoning, there was a recommendation that there should be more mixed-use zoning because historically it was, some areas are just residential or just commercial, and not having that mix prevents growth. And so those aren't things that are, singular goals, but they're absolutely things that I think we need to take into consideration as we're developing these plans and moving forward. Again, there's just so much, all these, the 1,000 pages of 15 other plans. Again, just wanting to make sure we're incorporating that under the umbrella of these maybe 3 to 5 central goals that we have going on over the next few years. Thank you.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
I just want to go on record. Please, no more roundabouts. No more.
Councilman Nell.
So I'm with you guys. The only way we're going to get out of this is bringing business in. The first thing we're going to have to do is change the mindset of our workers. I used to employ 100 people, and they all made $100,000 a year, and it's typical oil field stuff. Well, if we attract that kind of industry and that kind of business in this town, people are going to have to learn to work for a little less. So the first thing we have to do is have a supportive, willing workforce before we're going to get anybody to bring any kind of industry in here. And that's the $1 million question. How can we get business to this town? It's a wonderful place to live. If you can deal with the wind, it's a great place to be. So we're going to have to get our workforce in line, and we're probably going to have to offer some tax breaks, I'm assuming, to attract some businesses here. But that's the kicker to the whole thing. When we're in an economic downturn and we need more tax money and we need more jobs, people spending money when they're working. So if anybody could figure that out, there's probably 1 million cities in our country that are going to hire you tomorrow. But I'm with you. It's the way it's going to have to be.
Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, I guess to open up the citizen engagement package just a little bit more, we've included some things on your memo that, based on feedback we've gotten and, kind of what we would envision and so forth. Are we on the right track in terms of defining what citizen engagement means? Certainly, you've given me feedback that indeed adding committee work as a way of doing that as well would meet your interest also. But if indeed we're going to focus on these areas, I want to be sure that is okay with you and appropriate, because there's certainly a lot of ways we can go in each of those realms, if you will.
Councilmember Pollock.
I think there may be 2 different things in that bullet point. I'm not sure yet, but for me, citizen engagement, as we just spoke about, the committee work, I think the app that's being developed and continually sort of built onto, that is an avenue for citizen engagement. I think there are a lot of elements to citizen engagement, and I think it might be separate from managing our message and marketing our assets. And I'm not totally sure. Maybe it's the same sort of vision that can handle both of those things. But to me, educating our citizenry maybe goes with citizen engagement, but message and marketing might be slightly different. That's where, for me, like Casper has a great story to tell, and we need to do a better job of telling it to our citizens, but also to people who aren't our citizens, people who are visiting, people who are looking to bring a business here, something like that. So it may be more useful to split those out, or perhaps we can figure out a way to deal with it all holistically. I'm not totally sure.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
So I think citizen engagement, I mean, there's probably a lot of areas you can go with citizen engagement, but I mean, I really think it's that communication piece of what we're doing to communicate to our community and how we do that, whether that's through an official PIO, whether that's for having someone that, you know, can definitely deal specifically as a public relations type person to be able to get that information out, and how do we do that. But I think, how do we also harness social media? I think that there's got to be a way for us to harness that even more than we're doing that now. But I mean, for me, citizen engagement is how we as officials and how as government communicates to the citizenry. And so I think that's for me what that means, Carter, when you asked.
Councilman Gamros.
To piggyback on that point, I don't want to speak for the rest of council, but I'd love to see more from our local news sources as far as recurring segments or educational pieces. I personally would make myself available for those interviews or opportunities, so would love to see that from our local news sources. Thank you.
Councilman Nell.
I just wanted to say, social media, Kyle he's got the corner on the market. I know, I'm telling you, because I follow your page, and he's very informative, and you get great feedback on that thing. There's a lot of positive stuff that's coming from your page. I mean, because you're transparent with them, and so, you know, maybe a city social media page isn't such a bad idea. I don't know. You're going to have to find somebody to run it and deal with it. But I know he's had fantastic success with his, as far as the feedback you get from what I've seen. You'll have to answer. I can't answer for you, but sure seems like you're rocking it out of the park in that aspect. So.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, thank you. I appreciate that insight. Where we're talking about basic infrastructure support as well, I've heard many of you talk about ways in which, you know, potentially we do need to refocus more on hard services and so forth. One of the things that has been certainly standing out in my mind is with regard to our stormwater system. Over the last 2-3 years or more, we've been working on looking at an enterprise that would help us to generate those resources necessary to deal with stormwater. That is a pretty basic infrastructure need. And we have been woefully investing in it, as you can see with respect to the memo that we prepared for your review. I realize that there's a lot to that conversation, but would council be willing to entertain a conversation of that nature as we prepare for this budget and talk about that possibly in more detail? That's helpful. I appreciate that. We'll again, recognizing that that's not a commitment, but rather a commitment to discuss it. I do appreciate that, because that could play a critical role in dealing with at least one element of our basic infrastructure needs. Certainly the other thing, too, to play off of your point, Mr. Mayor, where we're talking about aged out building stock and so on, you know, that includes, in fact, I've just had this conversation recently with Mr. Cortez, that also includes lighting at our baseball fields. Believe it or not, we have lighting that is like, you know, tipping one way or the other because of its corrosion factors and so on. And so while we have made some progress in that regard, what I would invite you to consider as that category, as you're thinking about these things, are things like that. You know, those lights were probably installed back in the 80s as well. And we are trying to piece away those issues and deal with them. But we're also talking about irrigation. You know, we're talking about, fortunately, I got a favorable report with regard to the plumbing at the event center. We were really worried that was going to involve some major reinvestment. And so in that regard, where I say that it requires further evaluation, what I'm hopeful you'll be supportive of is us taking a real comprehensive, holistic review of that inventory, that aspect of our inventory, to where we can understand where really our deficiencies are from a very wide range perspective, taking into consideration, everything that we have. The old buildings at the fort, those legacy buildings. It just goes on and on in terms of what we have to deal with. And we certainly will plan to bring forward recommendations that deal with the most urgent, emergent kinds of things. But that would be another idea that I would suggest maybe we add on to what you proposed in terms of a plan that helps us get to the strategic part of that useful life of that broad, expansive inventory.
So we keep mentioning all of these things were built in the 80s, and in my mind, I'm thinking about everything that was built. I was here in the 80s, and I know what the economy was like. And I know that our population was significantly lower, and I know that the unemployment rate was skyrocketed. So we didn't have the money, we didn't have the population, and we certainly didn't have the infrastructure. So can we get history on maybe where all the money came from for us to build all of these buildings? Just to kind of, it's already been created, obviously, in the 80s when everything was at a serious decline. We still had money to make improvements.
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, I would say absolutely. You bet. We can include that in the analysis to give you context with regard to how we got this. Maybe it'll provide us some insight as to how we could do it again if we need to. Right.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
So not to belabor, but I want to maybe start moving us along. So Carter, do you want us to, because I know we're going to have to come back to this. This isn't something where we get this done in an hour and a half and we're like, now we figure out the goals for the rest of the year and everything's going to be successful. But if we have 2 or 3 that we're kind of putting out there for you to ruminate and think about, and then you can come back. Do you want us to give you solid 2, 3, 4 overarching goals right now, and then we come back to that and kind of go dive into it more? Or what are you foreseeing in that sense? Because I think we could sit and talk like this for the next, 2, 3 hours at this point, you know what I mean? So what are you kind of looking at then?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, Mr. Vice Mayor, I think I'm hearing the council coalesce around a small subset of priorities here. And frankly, it is giving me some direction as to what you'd like to see. I would like to rely pretty heavily on the executive team to help fill in some of those blanks and put a little flesh on the bones, if you will. But it sounds like you are kind of gathering around some real basic priorities. And just to be clear as to what I think I'm hearing, again, I think you are definitely rallying around the idea of infrastructure planning and major capital planning and some critical path analysis toward those end, results. I'm hearing citizen engagement over and over, and I like the way you put it, council member. The strategy to help improve that is probably a good first step and a good goal that we could build upon and probably bring some other ideas forward as well. And I keep coming back to basic budget strategy. We've been working on business plans for the recreational assets for quite some time now. It's hard for me to divest myself from those conversations that we need to have. And so for me, that's kind of a looser third priority, if you will. Again, real hard to get away from that, regardless of whether or not you think it's a priority, because we're kind of faced with that anyway, right? But the fourth priority, I guess, that I would suggest, based on what I'm hearing you say tonight, is our business infrastructure. And I think that does grab our technological infrastructure. I think it does talk about the question that you had, Mr. Mayor, as to what is our asset that we can focus on that maybe we don't have right now. To me, that's a pretty good short list of what you think your priorities are. And so my question back to you is, does that sound right? Does that sound appropriate for you as a large sort of 30,000-foot vision? Or are there things that I'm missing that perhaps we need to expand that list with?
So I'm getting a lot of thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
So, Mr. Mayor, if that is an appropriate view, then we'll take that back. We'll do some homework. We'll look at this video more than once, I bet you, and see what else we can kind of ascertain from what you've talked about tonight. And we'll try to bring you a fleshed out agenda as it relates to where we think you're going. And again, that gives you the opportunity to say, yep, this is it, or no, you need to tweak it here, you need to tweak it here, and we'd like to add this as well. So we'll try to get to work on that, if you're okay with that.
Yep. Everybody good with that?
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, move on to agenda review. Mr. City Manager.
Okay, I forgot to grab one of those grid documents. I handed them out, and I didn't keep one for myself. I'm a giver. What can I say? Thank you. I got 2 extras. Oh, do you? Yeah. Mr. Henley might need that one. Yeah, thanks, John. Actually, let me trade you. There we go. So, Mr. Mayor, as far as the agenda review is concerned, just a couple things that we want to bring to your attention. You might need that one. That's more complete. Let's see. You can see on the pre-meeting schedule that we do hope to bring you some ideas as it relates to alternating our business meeting dates with our work session dates. We also need to talk to you. I know you probably think, geez, didn't we just talk about financial policies? Why are we talking about it again? We do need some extra guidance on financial policies. And incidentally, I want to get all the financial policy discussion I can out of Mr. Pitlick, because he's leaving us at the end of March. And we need to just, someone said, getting, blood out of a turnip. We just need to really wring him out for that advice and guidance before we lose him. And he's asked for us to have that opportunity here next meeting. I'm looking over the agenda here. We'll continue our discussion about the Coates Road Local Assessment District. We'll wrap up potentially the vacation discussion of 7th Street. And we will bring back as a follow-up the discussion for proclamations as well, which you gave us some pretty definitive direction on. Moving on to the following work session, which would be March 9th. You can see what we have there. Gosh, a lot of conversation that is budget related. The capital budget review is going to demand a lot of your time that night. 45 minutes might be a little optimistic because there's a lot there. This will not be, however, that analysis that we just discussed. This is only our, kind of immediate year type agenda for the next budget year. Critical to have that conversation. Community promotions will be starting. And as a matter of fact, applications are out right now. And you'll get to weigh in on that. That's a pretty important discussion that, again, it doesn't drive a big pot of money, but it certainly does help with respect to what you'd like to see in helping some of our agencies bring people into our community. We've got a big budget amendment we need to talk about. A lot of it is fueled by the dollars we've taken in through the CARES effort. And so while it looks like a real big number, A lot of it is deals with that 11 or 12 million dollars that is associated with the new CARES fund. And I think that's all I have for agenda review, Mr. Mayor. I would, as usual, direct your attention to the future agenda items page, and that gives you a feel for where we think we are hearing you say you want to go for future meetings. And I would invite any questions you might have there, if indeed you do.
Councilman Gamera.
Thank you, Mayor. Carter, in regards to the community promotions, I had seen some news articles about that last week, but that's not something I'm familiar with. I didn't have anyone reach out to me with questions about it or anything, but if we are going to be discussing that at the 9th, I was just hoping, before I'm having to make any decisions on it, I personally would like some more information about what that program is, where that money's coming from, stuff like that. Thank you.
No problem. And Mr. Mayor, just to give you a real quick preview, that is the program that's been established by this council for decades. When I was here 20 years ago, we were doing community promotions, wherein council historically sets aside a little pot of money in order to stimulate events in the community that bring people into Casper. And so that's just a raw, real quick explanation of what the aim of that is. But indeed, we'll give you some more information in the memo that hopefully sets up some better background for you.
Are there any items on the future agenda that are not on there that somebody wants to add? Councilwoman Engelbrecht.
So what we were talking about before with the streets and the parking and the permits and all of that, is that going to be later on down the road? Because it's not on here.
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're suggesting a scheduling of a part 2 for this discussion tonight, right? Yes. And I would agree. I think if it's okay with the council, we can at least have a part of that discussion in the next work session. And you're right, that wouldn't be on here yet. But yes, that would be my intent if council would like to see that.
Are we good with part 2 on that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, part 2 is
Councilman
a recommendation though, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yep.
I thought that's where we were going.
Absolutely.
And then secondly, some things like that we've talked about previously, like the museum, stuff like that. We'll deal with that stuff during capital budget review, right? I'm guessing.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I am looking over the grid here real quickly. It's on the future, okay. We do have that on the back page.
Okay, good.
Which would indicate it needing a date to be set potentially by you all or whatever you'd like to see.
My opinion is it needs to be probably brought forth before the budget stuff, is my guess.
I would agree.
I think that would be appropriate. And I didn't see it on the back page, never been there. Sorry, that was a dig at Kyle.
Mr. Mayor, if it's okay with the council, why don't we try to set up a date for that and get it on your grid document and you can check it out and see if that meets your approval, if that's all right.
You good with that? Okay. Mr. City Manager, the only one other question on that bus stop safety shoveling. Did we, could we still maybe add in that discussion of a possible another bus stop over there at A&M Park?
Mr. Mayor, we have submitted that to the consultant who is doing that analysis for us.
Okay.
And it indicates that they would agree. So I think that's going to happen.
Okay.
And we're probably going to bring it forward under the capital budget discussion as a recommendation. So mostly because the timing for that request was perfect because we have that analysis taking place right now.
Okay.
So
all right.
Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
Right. Okay, anything else from anybody on agenda review? All right. Mr. City Manager, you have anything on legislative review?
Mr. Mayor, Council, as far as the legislative review goes, we're still kind of in the middle of the break, if you will. The session picks up again on the 1st. However, there have been a number of real critical committee discussions that we've tried to follow. We've had some offline conversations with some representatives as well with issues that we're concerned about. One of the meetings that we had very recently was with respect to Fire Pension A. And it does sound like that we don't have a bill coming forward that would, you know, require the cities to participate more than what we do already, which at this point is at this point none. However, it does sound like that's going to be an interim topic, which we would suggest is a very appropriate thing to do, and we will be engaged in that interim discussion very heavily. The other thing that I would give you by way of update, the conversation with respect to direct distribution seems like it's coalescing around a solution. It is not a solution that you know, will allow the city of Casper to get away without any impacts. I would tell you that we're probably going to see a reduction in direct distribution as a revenue for our general fund. The percentage that it looks like it's going to go is a 5% hit, which is better than what it could be for sure, but it's certainly not better than, you know, leave our revenue alone and let us have it all. So while I'd prefer that were not altered, it does sound like that's going to be the direction it goes. Without a doubt, given that we don't have a final bill at this point that's being signed, that could still take a lot of different directions given the debate that takes place over the next couple weeks, which, by the way, the session starts again on March 1. The other thing I was going to give you some update on, the WHAM organization has been working with the school board organization, which is kind of the school district's equivalent of the WHAM organization, as well as the county's equivalent of the same, to come up with a proposal for the, I want to say the education committee to consider pertaining to keeping school districts funded and working on a more plannable permanent solution for cities and towns to consider. While I don't have the details of that right now, I did want you to know that WHAM and WCCA, as well as the school boards, are working as a team to try to come up with a proposal to give our legislators. And when I do hear what that is, I'll be sure to make sure you're aware of that. Another conversation that's taking place is pertaining to I lost my train of thought. I'm going to have to come back to that. Yep, I've lost it. I think that's all I have by way of updates. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, we'll go council around the table. Councilwoman Lutz.
Nothing tonight.
Okay. Councilwoman Engbretson.
I had a really good senior center meeting yesterday, and you know, considering the pandemic and everything that's been going on with COVID, I think that they've done a phenomenal job in trying to keep their memberships up and gaining new members. They've been working really hard on trying to keep their budgets down and working and redoing things. They did the remodel and it looks great. The one thing that their concern is as they're anxious to like reopen and start trying to get members there to take part of the facilities, is that they've been 3 years without an air conditioning. And so they were kind of curious of where they were at with the air conditioning, so.
Councilman Johnson. Nothing tonight. Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. I have just a couple things. I wanted to first thank Carter and also Justin Farley, Paul, I can never say his name, Bertolio, and Brooke for the State of the Community address that the Chamber of Commerce put on last week. Also thanks to, I guess, Jason, their new executive director. Really good. I was really glad to have Carter there, really informative, and so he's doing a great job getting out there and educating and informing people in our city. Ray and I attended our first Casper Youth Council meetings. Well, I guess it was my second technically, but so we met with them last Sunday. Really cool group. They're working on strategies to increase some civic engagement amongst our youth and discuss some potential coordination with the school district to do some civics days or get some of us council members in the schools for any of us that are interested or willing. So looking forward to continuing to go to those meetings. And then lastly, Vicki Macy is a staff member at the police department. She will be retiring after 31 years. And so just wanted to thank Vicki for her service. The Casper PD put a really sweet video on their Facebook page I saw today. So if you'd like to take a peek at that, it's on there. So thank you.
Councilman Cathy.
Had a Joint Powers Water Board meeting today. That seemed to go well. And then I have a CPU meeting at 7 o'clock in the morning. So figure out who's bringing donuts. So that's all I've got.
Councilman Neal.
Thank you, Mayor. Casper Housing Authority is in fantastic shape. They've got some new products coming down the pike. I know a new building's in their future, a very big one. So they're providing some good housing for folks that are in dire need of it. And I know they've got an influx of maybe a little extra money right now. So I know they're looking for people to apply that need help. So please get a hold of them if that's something you need. I want to thank Carter and Ms. Becker and Chief for your work on the pathways. I think we could find a good happy medium that'll please everybody. So I appreciate that. And lastly, I want to thank the Chief for bringing out, because nobody could say Lisa Ingebretson. So I think after you've exposed her, we could probably just call her Councilwoman Grammy from now on.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thank you. Had a meeting yesterday, the OYD Advisory Committee meeting. It was my first one, so spent most of it just getting oriented, but did get some updates on state office building. Everything is on track there. Number of other developments in that area, and then heard about some new things that they are looking at, and some really exciting stuff for me that piqued my interest is a lot of the work they're doing in conjunction with the Amico Rios Joint Powers Board, and some of the synergies that feel like they're really lining up between those two organizations to kind of link those adjacent areas of our city together in some really interesting, exciting ways. So really looking forward to continuing to serve on that committee and keep everyone updated as we go along with that.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thank you. Just a few things. So you ran down there to talk to John for a second because I got a little bit confused, and Amber's probably going to remember too. So for the tobacco ordinance, nicotine ordinance that we're looking at doing, I am going to offer an amendment, but it was suggested to also table it for a date certain. So I forgot to mention that I'm going to bring that forward. And the reason why I'm going to do that is to give an opportunity for John to do a little bit more research on the best possible language that we can be used in this amendment. So I just want to give everybody a heads up that I'm going to do that. But the amendment will be coming. But first, I'm going to try to look at hopefully support for tabling it for a date certain, so Don has time to look at that amendment so we can do it right. Also, last Friday, the mayor and I had the LGBTQ Zoom meeting for their committee. Went great. They had a good conversation with some of the school district officials, having conversations about some of the issues that perhaps LGBTQ youth face in the schools. So they had a nice conversation about that. I was only there for about 30 minutes because I had to leave, but if the mayor has a little bit more information, he can share that because he was there the whole time. On Monday, I had our CATSI meeting. It was the Zoom meeting didn't work quite well, so we had to do it off of cell phone. So I had a hard time hearing some of it, but from what I heard, things seemed to be going okay. And then this Thursday, I do have the Casper's Council of People with Disabilities. As I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit about more of the stuff that you had mentioned about how we can help out with shoveling and et cetera on those sidewalks. I've also been invited to go to the Transit Strategic Development Plan recommendations on Friday, since I sit on the CATSI, so I will be at that as well. Very busy week with meetings. I am praying that I don't forget anything, because it happens from time to time, Carter. Thank you.
Okay, this doesn't have much to do with Casper, but I received a phone call from the Evansville Police Department today informing me that I missed some court date and had a warrant for my arrest, and come to find out it's actually a scam out there. And so I asked a lot of questions. He couldn't tell me who the chief was, the mayor was, whatnot. So, case in point, if it doesn't seem right, ask a lot of questions, and you'll get to the truth. So, the other thing is just to reiterate what Councilman Gamroth said. Vicki Macy, 31 years, and good luck in replacing her, Chief, because she did a lot of work over there, and she'll be a difficult person to replace. And congratulations to her on her retirement. There is life after the police department, just saying. No offense, but. And then this last week, I had the honor of doing a proclamation at Mimi's house, and they just opened up another home over on A Street for the boys. And so I was looking forward to going over and doing the proclamation, but when I got there, the thing that, when we gave the proclamation out, the thing that really hit home is Bradley Munzel, who was a city employee that passed away. That house is named after him and proudly displays his name inside that house. So I very much appreciate seeing that happen, and I am very glad that I was able to be a part of that. So that's all I have for tonight. So if we don't have anything else, we can adjourn the meeting. Thank you.